morning, everyone. Um, Welcome and sorry for the late start. The traffic seems to have impacted a lot of people, and there are some people coming from Alberton that are not here yet. But we're going to start because we appreciate you all being on time, and they'll join us as we go along. So yeah, very welcome here today, especially the group from Mokopane, Limpopo, who came a really long way. We really appreciate that. And we really want this conversation to be as broad as we can make it. And so these sessions are really the beginning of a conversation, and we welcome you engaging with us more after this session. There's an email address, which is mitigation@climatecommission.org.za, that you are welcome to send us further ideas. For those who've got a long trip home, you might have some ideas in the drive home, and you're really welcome to contact us and email us. We're keen to keep this conversation running. I'll go into a little bit more detail just now, but a couple of housekeeping things. Please keep your badges on. You need your badge to get into lunch. So this is your lunch ticket effectively. And then also please hand your badge back to us at the end. We want to be able to recycle them as part of our broader environmental commitment. So please remember, keep it for lunch and then hand it back in before you go. We'd appreciate that. For those of you sitting at the tables, you'll need to press the button on the microphone to be able to speak. And when you press it, the light should go red, and that means that your microphone is active, just so that people can hear you online is the main reason for the microphones. If you need the bathrooms, they're out this door, turn right down the stairs, and you'll see a kind of passage next to the restaurant. And the bathrooms are in there, and the restaurant that we'll be having lunch in is just to the right. So yeah, those were the main kind of introductory things, but really just to welcome you. And I'm going to give you some broader context as we dive in into why we're here. Just before I get going, how many of you were at the capacity building sessions we hosted last year, at the end of last year? One person. Two people? Not many people. Okay. And how many of you had the chance to watch the capacity building link that we sent you in the invite? Anyone? Okay. No, it's more or less what we expected. So we'll do a quick recap. So the agenda for today is I will do an introduction to why we're here, do a quick recap of what we did in the capacity building sessions at the end of last year, and we invite you to watch those. They are online. And then we will have reflections from some of your colleagues. We'll have Francesca de Gasparis, the Executive Director of SAFSI, and Reverend Zwandile Molo, the General Secretary of the South African Council of Churches, give us their input as part of this discussion around the nationally determined contribution. And then we will break for tea and coffee and then come back for a more general discussion, and then we'll go to lunch. Does that make sense? Any questions or concerns at this point? Okay, good. Good. My waffle, the room has filled up while I was waffling, so that's good. And we also have quite a lot of people online, so welcome to those of you that are online, and we look forward to your input as well. So if you're online, please feel free to put comments in the chat and ask questions on the Q&A, and we'll try to keep track of those as well, and then we'll see how the discussion goes. Okay, so I'm going to get going with my presentation, if the AV team can get it up quick. Okay, so what are we here for? So as part of South Africa's climate change commitments, we have to submit what's called a nationally determined contribution. And the nationally determined contribution idea was created in Paris. You might have heard of the Paris Agreement. And so all the countries of the world basically committed to setting climate targets that they would then try to achieve. And then we do this every 5 years. And in between these 5-year periods, we do something called a global stock take. So the UN, UNFCCC, the agency that look after climate change, will look at all the commitments, they'll look at all the efforts we've made, they'll look at the global emissions and work out if we are on track to keep temperature below the goals that we have. Right? And so the goal in the Paris Agreement is phrased as we want to keep temperature increases well below 2 degrees, and ideally below 1.5 degrees. Right? And so every country has to make commitments that allow us to meet those goals. Does that make sense? And so we are now in the update cycle, so we have to submit our NDC, our set of goals, to the UN by September this year. That's kind of the shifted deadline. It was supposed to be April, but I think only 8 countries or something have managed to submit it so far, so they've shifted it out to September. So that's the context. Now, an NDC is a really important thing, because in order to meet our climate goals, we would have to materially change the way that our economy is structured. And so it's not small changes, it's big changes that this demands. And of course, those changes have big justice elements. And so we want to make sure that we make those changes in the best interests of South Africans. Does that make sense? And so the Presidential Climate Commission, our mandate is to provide advice to the president and his cabinet around issues of climate change, just transition, and economic development. And so we think that this NDC discussion is very important because it has such a big impact on what the economy looks like. Does that make sense? And the way we work at the Presidential Climate Commission is we do a lot of research, look at what the science says, look at what the economic researchers are saying, look at what the social researchers are saying, but we also think it's very important to include stakeholders in these conversations. So we're running a range of stakeholder engagements, and this is one of them. And so you're all from the faith community. So we're engaging with the faith community, with youth, with local government, with national government, with the business, with labor and civil society. So we have one of these sessions for each of those stakeholder groups, and I'll tell you a bit more about the process a bit later. So part of how we think about the just transition, the Presidential Climate Commission released a thing called the Just Transition Framework. And so key principles to this transition that we have to undergo is that it's procedurally just, that we include people who are impacted by the decisions in making those decisions. And that's really the ethos behind these discussions. And we have restorative justice. How do we correct injustices that arise from historical actions? And then we have distributive justice or redistributive justice. How do we make sure that when we do these economic developments that people accrue the benefits and not wealthy capital owners? If that makes sense. So that's kind of the logic. And so we want to be able to engage with as many people as possible, make sure you understand what's happening and the importance of it, but then also get your ideas. What do you think should be in these documents? And that's what today is about. So we had the capacity building sessions at the end of last year, and now we are here to ask you, what do you think is important? Does that make sense as a sort of context and setup? Okay. Great. So I'm going to jump into the presentation just to give you a sense of the role of the PCC. So it's important to note that the PCC is not writing the NDC. The job of actually drafting the document that goes through cabinet and goes to the United Nations, that is the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. It's their mandate. What we are doing is providing advice and support. We can reach different stakeholders to them. Those stakeholders' voices are important. We can do some research. And so we are in the process of drafting that advice, and we will submit it to the DFFE as part of their broader stakeholder engagement. So they will also be engaging with people in different provinces. And so you will also have a second chance to engage on this process. And so there has been an NDC update before, and the PCC was quite influential in that update process. And we commissioned research to help us think through what the NDC should look like. We collated the research of others, including at the time a really important piece done by the business sector, the National Business Initiative, and we hosted public dialogues similar to these, but also sort of big online sessions, which we will also do. And so we're going to do that again. That's what we're doing. That's our process. And so we've done a lot of commissioning our own research. We've done a lot of reading of other people's research. And now we are in this process of public dialogues and discussion. Now, in climate change, we think about a couple of things. We think about adaptation, which is what do we have to do because the climate is changing? How does it impact crops? What happens with natural disasters? What happens with increased rainfall and flooding? All of these kinds of things that happen as a result of climate change. Fires are a big one. And we can do things differently. How do we warn people? How do we move people out of risky areas? How do we provide people with post-disaster support? Those are the kinds of things that we think about in adaptation. And interestingly, one of my favorite examples so far has come from the faith community, because the faith community are present in every community and normally have infrastructure, churches, mosques, etc. And so how do we, is there a possibility to use that infrastructure and the expertise that sits in the faith community to help people in these kinds of post-disaster response areas? The other area is mitigation. What do we do to minimize the emissions that are causing climate change? Right? How do we reduce coal in our energy supply? How do we shift from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles? How do we provide better public transport? These are the kinds of questions that we would think about in mitigation. And then the last bit is what they call means of implementation, which gets abbreviated to MOI. And that's really what kind of support do we need? We're a developing country. It's quite difficult for us to finance some of these transitional issues. And so what kind of support do we need? What kind of finance support? What kind of trade support? We'll get into a bit more detail. So each of these areas require us to give governments some advice, and they also must then build that into their NDC recommendations. So it makes sense. So I want to pause here just to see if everyone's happy where we are. Okay, fantastic. So how does the NDC, which is a commitment we make at an international level, get implemented locally is a key question. And so under the Paris Agreement and the subsequent agreements, we have to do two things. A LED, which is a low emissions development strategy. That's how do we do it? What sectors by when? Right? And governments are in the process of updating that. And then we have the NDC itself. What is our commitment? What do we commit to doing in adaptation and in mitigation? And therefore, what kind of support do we need? But then there's a domestic, local climate regulatory infrastructure. And the centerpiece of that is the Climate Change Act, which was recently promulgated. And the Climate Change Act establishes adaptation system requirements. So, for example, all government entities have to submit a risk and vulnerability assessment and a climate response plan. So they have to sit down and say, how are we vulnerable? How is climate changing? What does that mean for our local economy and our vulnerable people? And then they have to submit a response plan. So that's now in law. So every government entity has to do that. And then it also establishes the mitigation system, which consists of local targets for sectors and for companies. And so the sector ones are called sets, sectoral emissions targets. And if you add up all the sets, we should meet our NDC. So that's the connection, right? So we have these international commitments that are then embedded in local legislation that help us drive the implementation of those commitments. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of sector-level policies, the Integrated Energy Plan, the IRP for electricity, the mining plan, the Renewable Energy Master Plan. There are a whole bunch of local plans that should then feed into us achieving our targets, our sectoral emission targets that would then feed into us meeting the nationally determined contribution. So it's quite a sophisticated regulatory framework that allows us to push forward these climate targets. And the setting of the sets and the NDC are quite closely linked. Does it make sense? Okay. So an NDC is a very interesting thing. right? And what happened over time is the UN processes moved away from top-down regulatory measures. You might have heard of the Kyoto Protocol. It was an agreement that countries signed that legally bound you to specific targets. But they couldn't get very many people to agree to it, right? And after 20 years of trying to negotiate this, they basically gave up and they changed to a bottom-up voluntary system. And that's what the NDC typifies. They basically said every country has to describe their best effort to keeping temperature below a certain level, right? So it's bottom up. We get to decide. It's sovereign. It's our sovereign choice. But there are some rules. You can't just say, well, we're going to double our emissions, right? Because if everyone in the world did that, we'd go to 10 degrees of warming. Right? So these are kind of the rules. Each NDC has to be more ambitious than the NDC before it. Okay? It must be aligned with the requirements of science. You have to think through what the science is telling us. And 2 years ago in the United Arab Emirates, we kind of said we should be trying to get to a 1.5 degree trajectory. Right? It must represent your country's best effort. Right? It is hard. You'll see when we get into the detail. Changing from where we are now to where we need to be is not a simple thing. It's very difficult. It's very complicated. It involves lots of different systems, lots of different stakeholders. And so when we talk about that transition, we have to put in our best effort. Right? That's the guidance. And then we have to, in our submission, describe why we think it's fair. So if we want to take a big chunk of the global emissions, why do we deserve it more than someone else? Right? Does it make sense? So that is some of the rules. And then in the conversations, we have to have something that's locally credible. Right? On the flip side, if we decide we're going to switch off coal by the end of 2030, all the coal, of course, that's not going to fly, right? It would not make engineering sense. It would not meet stakeholder needs. So it wouldn't be locally credible. So you have to have something that's locally credible. We as South Africans think that this is reasonable. It is something internationally credible. The international community thinks that it is reasonable, and it has to be scientifically credible. It has to match what we see in the science. Does that make sense? And it's not so easy, right? There's not always agreement, particularly on the local international axis. And government powers change. So with the United States new government, they think very differently to what they thought even a year ago. And so this is not, none of this is particularly simple, but it's very interesting. So that's the framing of what an NDC is, why it's important, what the basic rules are, and what we're trying to do here. Interrupt me if you have any questions, please. So let's talk a little bit about adaptation. Why do we need to be thinking about this? Right? And so I mentioned that climate change causes particular risks and particular impacts to our communities and to our country. What do those kind of look like? And every couple of years, the UN body gathers all of the available global science into reports that they call assessment reports. And we are currently on the 6th cycle of this accumulation of evidence. And for the first time in this AR6, Assessment Report 6, we had a special chapter on Africa. And this is some of the impacts it describes. A 34% reduction in agricultural output. Reduced income and growth and increased income inequality for African countries relative to the rest of the world. So we are suffering more in Africa than anywhere else in the world. Over 3.6 million weather-related displacements. So these are people displaced from their homes because of a flood or a hurricane. We've seen that most recently in Mozambique. And then a 5% impact on GDP per capita for South Africa, a negative 5%. So our GDP has gone down as a result of climate change. Right? Do these seem like worrying things? Right? Here's the scary part. These are things that have already happened as a result of climate change. Here is what will happen. Right? A further 25 to 75% reduction in agricultural output depending on the crop and the scenario that we're looking at. a 50% drop in South Africa's GDP by 2100. So that's quite far away, but that's a big drop. And then with 1.7 degrees of warming, 17 to 40 million people. So we've had 3.6 million so far, but we risk having another 40 million. At 2.5 degrees of warming, 56 to 86 million people. So that's the population of South Africa displaced from their homes. Right? So these are very big impacts. And our argument is that we should be trying to avoid those impacts as much as possible. Right? And therefore, we need to engage on this international stage. We need to be able to set ambitious targets so that we have some credibility in this space. This is another study that was done that's done by the insurance sector that looks at what the impact on GDP is at various temperature increases. And so even if we manage to stay well below 2 degrees, Middle Eastern Africa would have a negative 4.7% impact on GDP by 2030 in this case. So that's not far away. If we go to higher temperatures, 14, 21, 27% impacts. So these are big impacts. We worry about them. And if we look at what the global stock take sets, remember I said we have the NDC setting and then we have a review cycle called the global stock take. The most recent review cycle was released 2 years ago, and they basically said we are heading to 2.9 degrees. So we're here somewhere, say 25%, just guessing, negative impact on GDP. If we do nothing. Right? Obviously, we're not going to do nothing. The debate is, well, what do we need to do? And we want to avoid this as much as we can. These are some risks that the Global Change Institute here at WITS are trying to track. And they think these are increasingly likely risks as a result of climate change. At day zero in Gauteng, in other words, Gauteng running out of enough water to meet its demand. Right? A collapse of the maize crop in sub-Saharan Africa, and in category 4 or 5 hurricanes making landfall on the East Coast. These are big risks. They have big economic impacts, they have big social impacts, and they're very unjust in their impacts. So the people that will be least impacted will be the wealthy behind their big walls in Joburg and Cape Town and Durban, right? The people that will be most impacted are the people who live in poor communities, in rural communities, and farming communities. And so it's inherently unjust the way that climate change plays out. Does that make sense? And if you are poor and you're impacted by climate change, you have less ability to respond. You don't have insurance, you don't have savings, you don't have spare assets. And so obviously the wealthy are also more resilient to these kinds of climate impacts. So we at the PCC are very worried about the physical impacts of climate change, and therefore we think mitigation action is very important. Right? Does that make sense? So the way we avoid these impacts is by reducing our emissions, not only here, but also globally. Does that make sense? So the level of emissions pretty much directly correlated with the temperature increase. So we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, notably carbon dioxide. Okay, are we happy so far? Do you have a question? Yeah, please go ahead. Just be closer to the mic, please.
Okay. Thank you. With my question in regards to this, what I understand is that this is a natural disaster.
Yeah.
Am I correct? Now, with you saying you have a way, meaning that you would like to come up with something that can try and minimize this. Is that what I'm saying? Now, what I want to understand is how are you going to do this effectively? Because with me coming here today, I'm worried about livestock. That's the main reason. I said, with livestock, how am I going to succeed with this climate?
Yeah.
So kindly answer me, how is your industry going to help us maybe have a better climate change in regards to livestock as well? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a great question, right? We're all worried about different things, right? Some of us are worried about human health. Some of us are worried about animal and livestock health. Some of us are worried about crop health. You know, some of us are worried about the economy, and it's all linked into what's happening in climate change. So in order to protect animal health, we need to keep temperature increase down, because the hotter it gets, the harder it is for the livestock to survive. And the late Bob Scholes, who was a professor at Wits, he used to say, you know, we've bred cows for so long that they're quite stupid now. So when it's hot, they just stand in the sun, you know, whereas game will go and stand in the shade. And they've got physical adaptations. Their faces are white, so they face the sun and it keeps them cooler. Whereas cattle don't have that, you know. So the higher the temperature goes, the more pressure it puts on the cattle stock. Also natural disasters, right? Where they're not protected from those kinds of things. So there are two things that we can do. When we talk about adaptation responses, can we build shelters for the cattle? Can we use different kinds of cattle? Do we shift to game instead of cattle? Like, what are the different ways that we can farm that help protect us from these changes? That's called adaptation. Then there's mitigation. How do we reduce the emissions so that the temperature doesn't go up as much and we have fewer natural disasters? And you have to do both of those things, right? So we'll have to do some adaptation anyway, but we want to try to keep the temperature rise to as low as we can. And then the other, and we do that through mitigation. So what we have to decide amongst ourselves in giving advice to government is, what are the things that are most important to us that we want you to be thinking about when you set these targets? Right? That's part of what today's about. What are we worried about? What must government be thinking about? What kind of support will we need? Doesn't guarantee we'll get it, but at least we're asking for it, you know? And so in this example, do we need cattle shelters? There is a study that SANBI, the South African Biodiversity Institute, have been doing, looking at exactly that. How do you protect livestock from higher temperatures in the Northern Cape, for example? Can we do that countrywide? These are the kinds of things that we need to be asking. Does that make sense? Okay, good. The last thing about physical climate risk and adaptation that we really have to worry about, and I'm taking slightly longer for the session that I had planned because many of you weren't at the capacity building session where we covered this in more detail, but just so that you have the right background. What is happening with climate change is the longer we leave it, the fewer options we have. Does that make sense? If we let temperature get beyond certain points, you can do less things. And so we really need to act urgently. And so this is taken from the AR6 report that I mentioned, basically just saying, you know, as you go further along, you have fewer and fewer options, so start now. And so there's an urgency to this that we kind of maybe forget sometimes. So when we talk about adaptation and resilience, we think this is a useful way to think about it. It doesn't necessarily mean it covers everything, but how do we build the resilience to preempt and withstand shocks and changes to our social, economic, and environmental context? What do we do about emergencies? What do we do about changing crop environments? What do we do about economic pressures that come from changes in fossil fuel prices, for example? And we think about this in three ways. Anticipation, how do we predict what's going to happen? How do we give people warning? Adaptation, what can we change? Building cattle shelters is one example. And then recovery, what do we do if when, unfortunately, something bad happens? And the example that most of us know about is the floods in Durban. What do we do after that? You know, some of those roads and bridges in Durban haven't been rebuilt yet. Right? We're not recovering. We're not designed to recover properly. And so when we think about all of the things that we have to do, and we try to provide this framework because it gives you a good way of thinking through what do we need to recommend. We need to be able to recommend that we're able to forecast and predict, do we have good weather warnings? You know? What do we do about adaptation? What kind of things do we do? Do we build our infrastructure differently to withstand floods? One of the examples we use is mines who have those big tailings dams where they put some of their waste. They have to build those dams stronger now, because more rain, more intense rain can break those dams, and then you have major pollution problems. So that, that costs money. Yeah.
Sorry, I had to stop you once again.
No problem.
I'm looking at anticipation.
Yeah.
We have rural areas like Diepsloot and such. No, not rural, squatter camps.
Yes.
Now, in squatter camps, say we're talking about anticipation where flood is coming. Those people, their living structure, one house is next to the other.
Yeah.
And most of them are when you look at the level of the ground is not very okay. You can see that they are compromised. Should flood come, you're talking so many lives that are lost.
Exactly.
So what are you doing to squatter camps? How are you notifying the government to do something? Say something happens in the squatter camp. Not only squatter camp, but I mean, you look at the living conditions around you. Say flood comes, what is going to happen?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, we do a number of projects in this space to try to, and Mandy, who's sitting at the back there, leads those projects. But these are the kinds of things that we want to get out from you today. Is what are the things you're worried about? What should we be paying attention to? And I agree, that's another excellent example, right? If you have these sudden storms that are different to how we used to have them, right? They rain for longer and harder. How does it impact people? How do people get to hospitals if the road is washed away? How do you warn people that it's coming so that they can evacuate and get what few possessions they have safely away? How do you help them do that? Where do they go? These are all very difficult questions. There are government agencies that worry about this and think about this, but we just need to kind of raise this awareness of the frequency and the magnitude of these kinds of disaster events as a result of climate change. What we want to do is spend the money here so we don't have to do this. Right? Recovery is expensive, rebuilding infrastructure, rebuilding homes, and if we can do this right, we have less of the physical impacts of disaster. Okay. All right. I've talked a little bit about this, but this was the UAE consensus on the global stock take, and just to kind of make the point that without all the things that we've done, we would be at 4 degrees today, or we would predict we would increase by 4 degrees. But because of all the actions we have taken, we are going to be somewhere between 2.1 and 2.8 degrees. I said 2.9, 2.8 degrees is the right number. Okay. We should note, though, that South Africa warms at twice the rate of the global average. So if the world warms 2 degrees, we warm 4 degrees. So we in South Africa are somewhere between 4 and 6 degrees, roughly. Something to worry about. But just to make the point that the things that we are doing are making a difference. We would be even worse. But we're not there yet, because we need to be at 1.5 degrees, or at least well below 2 degrees. And so there's still a big gap that we have to fill. And so the commitments that we've made globally are not enough. We implement all the commitments we've made globally, we'll get to 2.1 to 2.8 degrees. So that's why we have to make our commitments more ambitious over time. Simpiwe?
We have a question from online. It's from Reverend Rachel Mash. It's around the financing, I guess speaking about global commitments. So she asked, how much funding are we going to lose from the USA for the just transition?
Okay, that's a great question. I'm going to ask you to hold that question just for a little bit, because I've got some slides at the end on that, right? So basically the way the story is framed is the physical climate risks are bad. We need to avoid them. One of the ways we avoid them is by adapting. One of the ways we cope with the changes is by adapting. One of the ways we avoid them is by reducing our emissions and encouraging other countries to reduce their emissions. But then we still have to do a lot. We have to change our economy. Where does that money come from? What kind of support do we need? And I'll talk about that at the end. So this is one chart that shows how we need to reduce our emissions over time. And so you might have heard this phrase net zero by 2050. When you look at all the international research, our best chance of keeping temperature increases below 2 degrees is for us to not emit any greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide by 2050. Right? That's, was that 26 years away? Yeah, at the back we got a question.
Thank you. You can hear me, right?
Well, please get close to the mic. You have to be really right up to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Morning. My name is Lufuno Tichikange from Divine Truth of Christ Movement.
Sorry, even closer. I still can't hear you. Sorry. There we go.
Okay. With the net zero estimated to be reached by 2050,
Yeah.
us as South Africans, how far are we from reaching the net zero?
Okay.
Are we achieving our targets as we have set them? I think it was 2016 and 2021.
Yeah.
I just want us to have an appropriate
Okay.
conversation based on the reality, not on a wish list.
Okay. Interesting.
Thank you.
Okay. My next slide is on that. So let me, I just wanted to make the point in this slide that when we model theoretically, when we think about what do we have to do to get to net zero, most of the emissions reductions happen in the year 2030 to 2040. So that other point that I made, it's urgent. We need to do it now. If we don't do it now, we'll struggle to stay below. And every country faces this kind of pressure, all right? So to the question, like, where are we, right? So in the UAE consensus, it says that we should have, and I'm going to forget the numbers right now, I think it's 45% emissions reductions globally by 2030 and 60% by 2035. So if we take against our sort of 2019 levels, so if we take sort of 2019, 2020 emissions and we apply those reductions, you see that we have to get to, that should be 2030, 43% reduction by 2030 and a 60% reduction by 2035 would get us to 271 megatons of CO2 versus equivalent and 191. So that's what the globe has to do, right, on average. So we would expect that developed countries like Europe and the United States would go faster, and countries like ourselves that have development challenges would go slower, right? That makes sense. So we would expect the US and the UK and places like that to reduce quicker. And the UK proposed NDC is an 81% reduction by 2035. Right, again, it's against a slightly different baseline, so it's not directly comparable. And so we kind of see some of the countries doing that. Very surprising if the US NDC kind of, I mean, the US are withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, so they may not be relevant. So what does our NDC look like? So we've committed to 398 and 510 by 2025, between 350 and 420 by 2030. And we are in the process of deciding what this range should be for 2035. Right, that's kind of what we're doing. So this is the commitment we've made. This is what we are debating. Does that make sense? So where are we? Right, we are currently at about 450. So we're currently there somewhere. Right, and so we would have to get from 450 to somewhere between 350 and 420 in order to meet that target. And then you have to move that target to be more ambitious and more ambitious and more ambitious over time to get to net zero. Now the question is it realistic? Well, that's an interesting conversation, right? Remember what happens if we don't do it, right? Then we lose 50% of our GDP, 25% of our GDP quite soon, right? And so the decision is not simple, because if you don't do anything, you're faced with very particular impacts. And if you do things, they cost effort and time and money. And so the debate is, how do we balance these things? And it is very difficult, but we think you should be involved in it. Okay, so I'm going to show you some very quickly, and there's a lot more detail in our online training material, which was in the invite to this event. And so I'm going to go quite quickly, but it's important, I think, for you to watch that if you can. And there's a lot more detail. Have we lost my slides? Okay, well, I'll just talk to it for a little bit. So the question here that was asked is like, what is our best effort, right? What's realistic is really what we're saying, and what is our best effort? And so we have to approach that conversation in as a fact-based way as we can, right? If you just leave it to guessing, then people will struggle with ideology or think about their particular context. And so we have to have some structured way of thinking about this. And so what we've done at the PCC is we have looked as much research as we can find on these issues. What is the research saying about what's possible, about what the impact of not doing something is, right? And we can use that to start framing what we think that we can do. Obviously, it requires an enabling political environment and support. You have to be able to finance it. You have to be able to have supporting policy, right? And so when we frame the NDC, people sometimes talk about a conditional NDC. We'll do these things as long as we get this kind of support. If we don't have these things, then we won't do it. Right? And so you get a range in the NDC. So the top end is sort of what we will do without support. And the bottom end is what we will do with support. Right? So we kind of deal with that complex issue of what's our best effort, what's fair. Right? Now there's a conflict between what is our best effort and what is fair. Right? If everybody in the world says, well, we're special, our situation's harder, I'm not going to reduce quickly, then we're going to go to 4 degrees. Right? Does it make sense? So part of the Paris Agreement, a part of the ethos of it, is these are things we've agreed to do. Right? We've agreed to try to set more ambitious targets each year aligned with net zero, because that's what it will take, everybody in the world doing those same things in order for us to get there. So there's a interesting ethical part of this conversation to have, right? Okay, so I'm going to skip that slide. This is the research that we have commissioned as the PCC to help us think about this, right? We've done large-scale economic modeling, we've done climate modeling, we've done sector-specific models, we've done micro and socio-economic labor market modeling. What happens to households in Mpumalanga? What happens to people in Eastern Cape, right? We've looked at what happens with air quality and water. We've looked at what happens in the energy system. We've looked at how do you finance this? Where do we get the money from? How much money do we need, right? And on electricity, we've gone quite deep into the details. We've also looked at a whole bunch of other studies that have been done by the World Bank, by the National Business Initiative, by Bloomberg, by Sariti Institute, and we've tried to see what they think is possible and what they think is impossible to try to inform how we approach making recommendations. And in the modeling, you can do all sorts of things. What happens if finance is expensive? What happens if we have a small carbon budget or a big carbon budget? What happens if we make things locally or we import them? You can ask all sorts of kinds of questions to try to understand what is happening. Now, of course, models aren't perfect. And so they aren't the answer, but they help us think through the answer. But this particular study that we did with the University of Cape Town is interesting, because what they say, using this particular model, and it's one of the best models that we have available in South Africa, is as you get to a carbon budget of 10 gigatons, in other words, kind of maximum amount of carbon that you would emit between now and 2050, you get no economic gain. The economy doesn't get bigger and better if you emit more. So that's like a logical place to cap as our top end, right? Because if we emit more than that, there's no benefit. right? If you emit less, you start to have some economic impacts, at least in the model. But the model doesn't model everything. So what's not in the model are things like trade impacts. What happens if European countries impose trade tariffs? It doesn't have the climate impacts we've talked about, right? It doesn't have things like air quality in it, people's health and how much that costs, right? And so if you think about that, the big carbon budget, if we emit more, actually it's overestimating the economic returns because it's not counting these other things that might drag it down, right? And on the other hand, if you look at the ones that have smaller amounts of carbon emitted, you're missing new opportunities. What happens if we mine different things? What happens if we build new manufacturing facilities that are environmentally friendly, right? And so the lower carbon budgets are probably underestimating the benefit, right? But you're starting to get into, there's some things that are quite qualitative. So as I said, we've done work on air quality. So the difference between a high emitting and a low emitting scenario is 2,500 additional people dying early as a result of lung disease or heart disease. That counts for something, but how much, right? And that's part of the challenge. One of the studies we did using a big global trade model showed that the impact of border tariff adjustments means that our best strategy is to make environmentally friendly things, right? Another study we did looked at what's the impact of climate change. And so you could lose up to 5% GDP by 2030 from that study. Some other studies are higher than that. And so again, doing nothing is not an option. And so we've got to find out where the balance is. How do we do this in a way that doesn't disrupt people and make life impossible for people, but at the same time, if we don't do anything, life will be a lot more difficult for people. The last point here on justice and how we think about justice. If we want to stay below 1.5 degrees, we can only emit 275 gigatons of carbon across the world. So if we want to emit 10 gigatons, right, that means that we will take 3.6% of that total, right, which is much more than what we contribute now. We're about 0.6% of global GDP, and we're about 0.8% of the global population. So we'd be saying, if we did that, we'd be saying we're very special, right? Because we deserve 4 times our current economic contribution. Does that make sense? So the counterpoint to what can we achieve, what is realistic, is what is fair. All right? Does that make sense? Everybody has to reduce. All right, so that is adaptation, mitigation. So adaptation is how does climate impact us? Mitigation is what do we do about our economy? How do we change it? And we've got lots of studies that kind of show that we can change our economy. And in fact, it's better for us to change our economy. But we need some support, and that's what means of implementation is about. Some pure.
We've got a question from Abraham Mnguni.
Okay.
And so he's got 2 questions. The first one is, what are the plans in place to actively incorporate indigenous knowledge systems? It's IKS, so I think it's indigenous knowledge systems into climate change adaptation and mitigation plans. And the second one is, how does one start advocating for policies that recognize the rights and needs of indigenous people in climate change activities?
Yeah, what a great question. So I think, I'm not going to have answers to all these questions, right? Part of what we're trying to give you the opportunity to do is to raise these kinds of questions in the policy framework. So when we talk about the NDC and what we want included in the NDC, in my head, when you're asking me these questions, I'm flipping them into recommendations, right? And so we want, based on that question, indigenous knowledge systems included in how we think about climate change and how we gather information and how we think about early warning systems, right? And this is the one opportunity for you to be able to integrate those kinds of ideas into the NDC, one policy measure, but quite an important one. So yeah, so please kind of make that recommendation if that is important to you. The means of implementation is the kind of support that we could get, and you can get support in a couple of ways. Finance, that's the one we all think about, right? And the JET IP, the 8.5, which is now $11 billion support from some countries, Europe, UK, is one example of that, right? Capacity building is another example, right? Technology transfer, and that should be intellectual property, apologies. Technology transfer, what technology have you got that's better than ours? How can we use that without undue cost? And then trade, right? And a famous example of trade currently that people debate is this thing called CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is the thing that the European Union have passed, that if we try to sell goods to them, they're going to tax us on our carbon content, right? Which makes our sectors less competitive and it protects their sectors. It's quite punitive. We don't like it as a country. We're saying we disagree with it. But what else can you give us? Can you give us incentives rather? If we can make green hydrogen, will you give us a preferential trade agreement? Right? That's the way we could think about support. And so these are kind of the four categories. And the way we kind of think about that is, how do we use this strategically? We're not going to get $100 billion of grant money. Just not going to get it, especially now with the changes in global politics. But we might get 10. How do we use that 10 billion to get local capital deployed in the right ways? But how do we incentivize investment in the right places? Right? Same thing with capacity building. If foreign countries are going to help us do training, what are the key areas that we need support? Right? Same thing with technology. Where do we need the support? So as a sort of devil's advocate, everybody's talking about the grid. We need to upgrade the grid. How do we finance that? Well, we probably don't need support to do that. What we need is a proper enabling environment and perhaps some support from the private sector. Right? And we do it locally, create jobs locally, we make things locally. We don't necessarily need support for that. Producing green hydrogen, we definitely need some support. Right? And so it's just understanding where do we need support, how will we deploy it. Capacity building, my personal opinion is building the capacity of local government is important. Delivering services, being able to do the risk and vulnerability assessments, being able to do the climate response plans, those are big tasks. But that's the kind of thing that we have to be sort of thinking about. Okay. The numbers are big. So I think someone asked like how much money. These are different models. They look at different kind of constraints, but you can see that, so you should, 8 trillion, 6 trillion is quite a big range, but it's a lot of money, right, that we need in terms of support. And what's key is for us to think about, well, this is the amount that you need to invest, right? So the better we get at leveraging international support to create local investment, the easier we'll get to these numbers. We will share these slides with you. So what's happening so far, right? We get about 130.6 billion rand of investment in various things. And this work was done by Kwezikazi over there. And where do we get it from? And what do we spend it on, right? And there's two important things that I want to bring to our attention. Most of the finance we're getting is from the private sector, and most of it is domestic. So this transition is happening already. We are already investing. It's already being done by our domestic private sector, but we need to scale it up a lot. The other thing that I want to point out is most of this money is spent on mitigation, and most of it is spent on clean energy. We need to spend on other things, in particular, adaptation. At a United Nations level, they talk about 50% split Spend half the money on adaptation and half the money on mitigation, but we're getting nowhere near that. So we need to spend a lot more money understanding climate impacts and how we adapt to them. So that's the framing, right? And we're going to have some of your colleagues from the faith sector provide some input now. And my team are probably panicking because I've gone way, way over my time. But it seemed like it was important for the discussion. So I think how we'll adjust the program a little bit is we'll have one or two more questions in the room, and then we'll let our colleagues from the faith community give us their input, and then we'll have a longer discussion with the time that we have left. So my apologies for running over, but it felt like I needed to do it, just to give you the sort of background. There's a question at the back.
Thank you. The first thing I wanted to say when you were talking about issues of ethics was that the right to a healthy environment is an international right. It's a right in our constitution. It's a right in the African Union. So it remains a right. So when we are working on this, how are we making sure that the constitutional right is protected, because it's there? I think we need to work within the framework of the constitution. And in terms of when you're saying that our strategy, we need to go green, I just wondered, how are we promoting green industrialization in South Africa? I know the president of Kenya talks about it. I don't know if they are doing it yet, but I think part of that strategy, it has to also be building on our own green industry. And you also mentioned it, we import almost everything. So if we are importing, we are also increasing the CO2 emissions. So how are we also going to ensure that our plans are also covering the green industrialization, and how are we going to do localization? And from a budget perspective, we have a bigger problem. I call it a pandemic, which is corruption. How are we now going to contribute to ensure that our plans are not thwarted because the money is going where it's not supposed to be going? And in terms of infrastructure, as you were saying, we need infrastructure for this. Our infrastructure as it stands now has deteriorated. So we need more to invest on the infrastructure even before we think about mitigating and other things, because the infrastructure that's there is not helping us to be socio-economically viable, if that's the right English word. And the other issue that I think for me is important, you speak of technology transfer. I've asked before, I don't know if PCC has the ICT working group, because that's where the technology comes from, the research and the innovation. And if we are talking without the tech and the innovation, research and innovation within our plans, I'm not so sure how we plan to achieve this. And we are going to be perpetuating imports as exposed to having a balance. Thank you.
Yeah, very interesting. So these are precisely the kinds of things that we want to hear from you. And we're a little bit, the situation we're in is complicated. We want to hear from you. We've got lots of ideas. I could talk about green industrialization for another 5 hours. But I don't want to do that now, because we want to give opportunity to hear from you. But so the way that I'm kind of treating this engagement is, in your questions, I am hearing things that are important to you and possibly the constituency that we need to include in our feedback to government, right, to the president. And so this idea about ethics and building on what we've already agreed as a society is very interesting. What's in the Constitution? What's in the Climate Act? There are things that we've already agreed to. Let's not re-debate and reopen those things, right? Although people do debate and reopen those things, particularly when it comes to kind of governance and the role of the courts and things like that. The PCC, the commissioners, have already released a document called the Just Transitions Framework, and that talks about 5 things that we have to do, right? Economic diversification, which largely talks about green industrialization, is one, and it includes things like localization, finance, governance, which kind of addresses some of the issues around corruption, social protection, right? Not everybody gets caught in the employment net. How do we protect people that are not, right? And then the 5th one, I'm forgetting. Governance, there's a 5th one that's equally important, but that I'm forgetting. But it kind of helps frame the kinds of things that we do. And so the PCC philosophy in green industrialization and economic diversification, we think that's the key. It's easier to understand what we might lose as a result of climate change, right? Big, heavy emitting, hyper polluting industries. But what do we put in its place? Because we can't, to the practical point, we can't switch them off if there's nothing else, right? How are people going to be employed? How are they going to earn livelihoods? And so that emphasis on what is new is very important, and is a 5-day session in its own right. So our challenge here is we want to hear more from you. We're going to be taking these kinds of notes, and we're going to make sure for, if we find the idea of green industrialization is widely supported, that will go into our recommendations. There's insufficient focus. I don't know how we'll frame it. I'm making it up as I'm standing here. Green industrialization needs far more focus because it leads to employment, et cetera, right? And who should be involved, You can't do green industrialization without the DTIC. So it can't be a DFFE process. It has to be a DFFE and DTIC process. But also you have to fund it. Okay, so Treasury has to be involved. So it can't be a DTIC, DFFE process. It has to be DTIC, DFFE, Treasury process, and you basically add the whole of government the more you think about it. So the whole idea of how do we think about changing our economy, how do we think about responding to climate change, has to engage the whole of government and all of us as stakeholders. Okay, so I think that's quite enough from me. We are going to have 2 speakers now, Ms. Francesca de Gasparis, as I mentioned, and Reverend Nzwandile Molo. And then we'll probably break for tea after that, and then we'll break for tea and then come back for a discussion, which will unfortunately be a little bit shorter than we had planned, but we've had some of the discussion now, so hopefully that is acceptable to you. Okay, thank you. Francesca, are you online? Can you hear us? Are you ready to go?
Good morning. Yes. Hi, Steve. Hi, everyone.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Great. Okay, thanks. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm absolutely thrilled to be with you this morning. I'm calling in from Cape Town, and I wasn't able to be there in person. As you know, only ground transport was allowed for this meeting, which I think is fitting when we talk about our NDCs, our response to climate change. Things like flights do come into the equation. Steve, as always, you've wowed me, and I'm sure everyone in the room, with your incredible, astute discussion and explanation of the NDCs, of the policy framework, and all those acronyms. So I'm the executive director of SAFC, which, as you can see up on the screen, is the Southern African Faith Communities Environment Institute. I've been asked to speak today, and what I really want to do is take a step back from some of the more in-depth policy that we've been hearing from Steve, and just really frame now a little bit more about the role of the faith sector, because it's very important that you all are in the room and that there are all of us here online as well. Why are we here is the question, and what role do we play in this process? So we've looked at a lot of these different technical, economic aspects. But one of the things that I think is quite difficult when we start getting into this and we see the amount of time we could spend exploring the impacts of climate change right across society is to continue to be inclusive and make sure the issues that we're talking about are accessible and understandable to all. because as a collective, we have to respond to the challenge. So what is the role of the faith sector? First of all, I want to talk about the legitimacy of your presence, of our presence here, of our voices, and the importance of us engaging seriously in the consultative process. As people of faith, we really cut across all aspects of South African society, as we all know. But also, many of you are representing parts of society that are most vulnerable to climate change. And with faith, with all of our faiths, comes this ethical and moral imperative. What is it that we are called to do, and how can we respond effectively? And that really is trying to take us out of business as usual. So when we look at the faith sector, we're really talking about the hearts and minds of people, which, as we see in any social change, in anything to do with the fabric of society, you need that moral authority to come along and to actually usher in the change that we need to see in this just transition, in this response to climate change, which really does change how we live, how we conduct our daily lives. So the faith sector is part of civil society. And in that, we are the witnesses of the impact and the devastation of climate change, and the impact and devastation of non-action or poor decision-making by the authorities. And in South Africa, the history here is of moral accountability coming from faith leadership to government. And we must really remember that moral authority and that capacity to share the real lived realities on the ground. That is essential for this process. Let's make no mistake. We can have all the most brilliant minds in the world, like Steve and his colleagues, but unless we understand the lived realities, we will not be able to tackle climate change. Because the solutions and the actual bringing along the whole of society, making the change, needs to happen from the ground up, in my view. So we must meet each other in the middle, come with the policy expertise, and we must challenge it as those who understand what's actually happening. So there's wisdom that you hold. And I really want to talk about the wisdom of theology and the message to modern humanity. Some of the deepest thinkers that I know are people who have studied theology, who look at the problems of humanity with a compassionate lens. And those are faith leaders like all of you here in the room. And I want to mangle a couple of famous quotes by saying those who live an unexamined life are destined to repeat the sins of the past. You know, some of that is Socrates, some of that is probably from sacred texts, but you know what I'm trying to say. We need to change the way we're doing things and do it differently. So I also want to talk a little bit about the unique position we are in South Africa. We both are dealing with the legacies of our past political and, as a result, social and economic injustices that wrought on society. And because we're still dealing with the legacy of apartheid and colonialism, we also have knowledge and experience of what poor governance look like, and the impact that how much it takes to re-knit the fabric of society. And I've long thought that the rest of the world needs to learn from Africa, and South Africa in particular in this case. We're also unique in the fact that we're such a big emitter. But I also want to talk about the geopolitical landscape that we're in now. We can see leadership in the North abandoning common sense, abandoning science, and elections bringing a fear-based leadership. And we can see with Trump and others that the US and other countries are going in the wrong direction in terms of climate change. And we must not forget that. To move away from science-based thinking and rationalization is not in keeping with our faiths and our demand for justice. So we must use all the knowledge and information we have in order to make the right decisions for the communities in South Africa. So what are we being called to do here in South Africa? What does it mean for us in this changing geopolitical landscape, where we see huge global energy companies like BP renouncing their renewable energy decisions, pushing us into that tipping point that Steve spoke of, reaping destruction and devastation on our communities? That's a pretty dark future. But I don't think that all hope is lost. I think it's really important to emphasize where we stand as South Africans. What basis upon do we make decisions? And what basis do we look at the world from? Well, I think what we look at the world from is, what does freedom really look like for all of us? We have very hard-fought freedoms in South Africa that many of our previous, our now ancestors gave their lives for. Freedom in South Africa is not selective about your gender, your standing in society, your wealth, your sexual orientation, your faith, or your location. It's enshrined in our Constitution. It's one of the most progressive in the world and in Africa. So I think we really should just take a moment to say, we know what justice looks like. We have it enshrined. And now we need to, as people of faith, remember justice and love are at the root of all of our belief systems. And for people also who don't have faith, so you're not excluded from this. So let's talk now a little bit more about climate change and its impacts. We've been hearing very eloquently about its impacts. We started to look at things like the issues of indigenous knowledge, cows. What does this look like when our natural system is going to be so disrupted and it's already wreaking havoc? We know, as we've heard from Steve, that we will be impacted at least double from the rest of the world. So for us to do nothing is absolutely an impossible scenario. We cannot roll back like others seem to have the privilege to do. And we are one of the biggest emitters. So in this inequality, in this major emission that's coming from South Africa, we know that our economy is based on the burning of fossil fuels. And that drives our homes, oil, gas, coal, paraffin, all of these things, coal-fired power stations, where our electricity comes from, it is based on fossil fuels. We export coal, as many of you know, making us the 10th largest emitters, as we've heard. So this burning is what's releasing all the carbon dioxide. And it's really important that we find a way to articulate that to our communities. So I'm not just calling on you all here today to bring your incredible intellectual knowledge and weight of your communities, but also to take back. I think also one of the things that we need to realize that even plastic, the scourge of many of our communities, is directly linked to fossil fuels. It's made from waste, from oil and gas. So a lot of the challenges that we face right now in society links us back to this problem of the emissions of fossil fuels and the impact that it's having. And when we look at what are some of the other ways for us to adapt, how are we going to deal with this problem that we face in terms of where we're getting our power from? Unfortunately, using local wood, which many of us are still dependent on, local biomass, actually reduces our capacity to adapt to climate change. So it makes us more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. If we cut down all the trees around our area, we will be extremely vulnerable to climate change. It allows the ocean to come in further in the mangrove areas. It allows worse local climatic conditions. It's a huge problem, which I'm obviously don't have time to go into. And my time is limited, so I'm going to try and keep it brief. So yeah, I feel that our job as SAFC, as an organization that works with all faiths and none, and you all in the room and online, is to be able to explain the feedback loop of climate change to our communities and congregations, so they understand the pressure we are currently putting on our environments and start to explore locally what we as communities of faith can do differently. We all have a part to play. And it's very important that in a healthy democracy, the communities that you work with, their voices matter. So it shouldn't be that you have to be educated, you have to be able to be in the room to have your voice heard. And we really want to try and get representation so we get a true reflection of what people are grappling with. This will help government make the right decisions, and where they aren't making the right decisions. You know that the space around energy procurement is very conflicted. I would say we as SAFC do a lot of challenges to government to ask them to stop speaking to vested interests, to listen to what we need for a country such as ours in terms of energy procurement. So it's an ongoing discussion battle that we all need to be a part of to create a low carbon emission future. So I want to also give a little bit of technical input into this consultation process. And as I was prepping today, I asked some of my amazing colleagues to give me some input on what they think we need to do in terms of the nationally determined contributions. What do we need to see in these NDCs? So the challenge for us is, and what we want to ask government to do, is to be more ambitious in mitigation. So that's reducing our carbon emissions. We need to show climate leadership, as I'm calling on each of us to do. We, South Africa, needs to show climate leadership from the top in these uncertain times, in this geopolitical landscape. We need to get real and detailed with adaptation. This is where biomass, local indigenous knowledge, and all comes in. What does it mean if we're not able to stop too much of the temperature rise? How do we adapt to this change? What do we need to do to be ready to keep ourselves safe and to keep people able to live? And what does the engagement need to look like? So this is the thing about the language that we use, not using too many acronyms, breaking down what we say into an accessible way so everyone can participate. We believe that the NDCs need to really speak back to the issue of the just energy transition. What is a just transition? And we as people of faith, it's not just just, it's justice. It needs to be about making sure that everyone is heard and that we really look after those most vulnerable in society. That's what climate change is calling on us to do, to not leave people who are most vulnerable to be those most impacted. I think that would be a failure on our part. So we also want to, now I'm going to get a little bit more technical. One of the issues that we're seeing in Africa is this re-emergence of the carbon markets, a big concern. There's something called Article 6, and there's all kinds of ideas in Article 6 around carbon capture and storage, which are logically flawed. These are the false solutions to climate change. We know that when people talk about mitigation, they move to false solutions. Even gas, people say gas is a transition fuel. It is not. It is a greenhouse gas. It is a fossil fuel. It cannot be part of transition as far as we are concerned. If we're serious about justice, also to do with nuclear energy, that should not be part of a just energy transition. I don't have time to go into why, but you know our website has a lot of information about these issues. We are constantly trying to examine policy and make it accessible. So we've got information about Article 6, but information about nuclear energy, and partners in civil society look at issues like gas in detail, coal, and so on. So we need to be careful in how we account for carbon and how we look at our ecosystems. Cape Town is a fire-prone ecosystem. So that's not going to be appropriate with this carbon capture and storage and some of the other carbon sequestering concepts that are coming up. So we need to think about the whole ecosystem and the impact that climate change will have on it in terms of our ability to capture carbon. I think also socially owned renewable energy systems that really are based in local communities is not a pie in the sky. It's what we need to see in terms of climate resilience. And we feel very strongly that the monies, the climate finance, which is part of the NDCs, needs to be looking at those most vulnerable, and needs to reach those most vulnerable. And that's local communities, because there isn't a one size fits all. Someone who lives in a place with deep shadow may not be able to have solar just there by their homes. What's another solution for them that would be effective, clean, affordable, and safe? And, you know, I touched on plastic before, but there's a huge issue around the legislation around packaging, around waste management, and about the unaccounted emissions that comes from landfills and illegal dumps. And really, you know, this is such a strong link to the social issues we face, the impact that dumping has on our communities. There is no way, and we really need to start thinking in terms of circular economies and how can we stop talking about waste. There's no such thing as waste in nature. Everything gets used for some purpose. And so we really need to rethink how we work. There's also a call for local government and municipalities to really think about service delivery. I know many of you are concerned about service delivery. This directly links to climate change again. What do our NDCs say about how local government is going to be able to support communities? Looking at things like how we manage land, what vegetation is used for things. How does that create an adaptive and resilient environment? So these things are all linked to each other, even down to education, transport, and so on. So in summary, we need to advocate for local vulnerabilities. Take very serious note of them and make sure they're being shared, promoted, and financed. And we need to push for that. It's not going to happen without us saying we need to get local. So please raise your voices on this issue. Look at what is a local adaptation policy. What is that going to look like? We need to be organized and we need to advocate at the national level. That's why I'm so pleased that the next speaker today is Reverend Molo from the SACC. He's the General Secretary. They just launched their own climate commission. So there's a huge push within the faith sector to really get organized around climate change. And I really want to invite you to join us if you're not already there. So let's keep working together to translate the complex and difficult challenge we're facing. Let's help our communities to raise their voices and respond to the challenges, and ensure that the NDC and local realities are really linked to each other so that we are positioned to be recognized as serious actors that can facilitate the solutions to climate change. Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Francesca. That was really, really great. I think we might have a concluding line for our recommendations. Justice and love should be at the root of all of the things that we do. That sounded pretty good to me. So thank you again, Francesca. So the next input is going to be from Reverend Molo, and I'm going to hand directly over to you, Reverend, if you're ready to go.
Good morning. Do you hear me? Am I audible?
Yes, perfect. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you very much to Francesca, and greetings to everybody in the room. My deepest apologies that I could not be with you. I do not have the wonderful what's the word, explanation that Francesca has, that I say I cannot travel because of what might happen with flying in. It's just that commitments are too many at this instance. So I apologize profusely for not being with you there. Secondly, the SACC takes this as a privilege to be allowed to share its thoughts. They are not comprehensive, they are not exhaustive, but they are thoughts that we have as part of the work we do in the ministry of Christ in the country that we live in. So we want to start simply by saying thank you very much, and indeed we look forward to hearing the conversation and the fruits thereof that are going to come out of this conversation. Francesca has in many ways framed the theological outlook and the ethical commitments we have around this matter. So I'm not going to try to be too detailed and aware of your time. I'm going to try to be as short as I can be. The first thing I want to say, as the SACC, we see where we are. And Steve, you use the word ambitious. We want to say it's not a matter of only being ambitious in trying to do and understand the context in which you use the word. For us, it is a matter of survival. For us, it is a matter of the preservation and protection of life, not only for ourselves, but for the next generation. And therefore, the need for the NDC to act and provide direction ambitiously is one that must be located to us in what we consider to be a question between life and death. That these activities for us must indicate that we are deliberately choosing life over instruments of death. And that means, therefore, we are not only ambitious and in terms of the worldview, but we are also committed in acting boldly in order for us to make the necessary changes that we are going to need. The faith community indeed is cross-cutting, because in the pews we've got people who are up in society in terms of income, but who also live with the reality of many of our people who live in poverty. And as the presentation has indicated, they live with the worst impacts that come from the decisions that we take and we make. The SACC in its conference last year launched this climate justice commission because it said to itself, as a country and as a world, we are facing the crossroad. As the presentations themselves in their most dramatic and their most scary of presentations indicate, doing nothing is not an option. Doing nothing actually is doing nothing is a choice that only leads to death. Doing nothing is us saying the way things are is the best way to make sure that we go to dying in that general sense of that word as quick as possible. We have to stand up then and say, what is it that we can do? So we need to say to our political leaders or economic leaders, to those who business leaders, this is urgent. It is not something to play around. We cannot fiddle with our hands as this thing is taking place. What we believe needs to be done, and this from our faith communities, I'm going to start where Francisca left off. We need to invest in making sure that in mitigation and in adaptation, we invest in making sure that our poor people are not left out of this process. Our survival is going to be measured by how much we can invest and localize these interventions so that in our interventions of what we do around them, we invest in making sure, as Steve has indicated, what does it mean for early warning system for people of Diepsloot, as I said earlier on there, for people of a village somewhere in Limpopo? What does it mean for local government, which is not funded in a way that reflects their needs, but it is so funded in a manner that the resources of municipalities, if they're not destroyed by corruption, they are not able to sustain the basic life of our people. So how do we make sure that NDC allows itself and invests in making sure that the local communities, both in solution, but also in adaptation and mitigation, we invest in what they can be done with them, with those communities. That's very, very important. Secondly, we need to work very, very hard into asking the question, what kind of behavioral change investments we can make. And that speaks to education, making sure that we find the language and the tools that makes our people understand what are the things that they face on this issue of climate change. What can we do in the localities to make people understand in their own local language, but most importantly, in a way that makes sense to them, to bring awareness, so that people in their localities can develop not only habits around what the things that they can do or can't do in a global sense, but also the things they can do at a personal sense, at the sense of what is it that we can do as churches, as mosques, as temples, so that our people can be given enough knowledge and understanding and link their faith positions into the care and the protection of the climate and of nature. And how then we can, the NDCs, we can see that as a big part of the strategy to make sure that education is so powerfully shared with our people so that behavior is changed in the things that we do. And that means for us in many, many ways that we need also to have some kind of direct conversation. And maybe, Steve, one of the conversations we can have as part of NDC is how to speak ethically and ethical and justice matters directly between faith leaders and business people, so that that conversation is not only left to what businesses want to have as businesses, but also for business to know the ethical and justice questions that they must also face, so that when they do what they need to do in business decisions, those decisions are not devoid from the ethical and the justice commitments that we must all share as society. And therefore, part of this work is to say to us, as we speak, as we get consulted as the faith communities, there might also be a need of a South African conversation that is not mitigate. I mean, that is not controlled where there's only one sector speaking with you, another sector speaking with you. Maybe there might be a part of a conversation where we are all South Africans coming together in one room and we speak truthfully to one another and we speak prophetically to one another, so that our ambition of the NDC and our reduction of emission and the mitigation of this impact and the adaptation of behavior is one that is a common effort, not done in silos where people speak in their own little spaces, and then the NDC then gets their own support there. I mean, the recommendations there. The issue of financing, to be looking away from facts and truth, is one that has no moral or ethical base on which it runs its business. It is a world where the politics have no moral value or no ethical value, and therefore sometimes the business itself and people with big money have no moral basis that allows them to do what we need to do together as a people. So we want to say that ethical leadership, both at national level, that must be located in the spaces that our political leaders are at, is important for us to do this work. The South African Council of Churches is standing ready to work with anybody in the following areas, really of educating our people, of making sure that our people are also, in terms of how they use energy and how they access energy, is one that is able to make sure that we do not live with exacerbation of the disasters that come. Thirdly, it also stands ready to advocate for any policies that make sure that the energy generation of our country is not done at the expense of the future of our people who still have to be born and who still must live. The conversation about just a transition, and as Francesca says, for us it's just a transition. Our conversation must be such that allows the transitions to be responsible not only to us who are living today, but is responsible to future generations. And therefore, the movement from fossil fuel into a much more justice and ethically committed generation of energy must be one that we must all work together. The SACC therefore says, indeed, it is quite correct, indigenous localized solutions and knowledge needs to be respected. Faith communities are close to the people on the ground, and they can do and they can work seriously to deal with all the things that we can all work together. I'm just going to read in my conclusion. I'm going to read what is called, what we said when last met with what we call eco bishops, which we met last year in 21 to the 23rd of October under the auspices of SASFI. But in that meeting, we had SACC, we've got other bishops from other churches. I want to read something from them so that we can all understand then where the church stands on this. The statement says, with deep awareness of the global impact and profound concern for the suffering caused to the poor by the climate injustice, energy derived from fossil fuels and forced energy solutions to climate change, widespread industrial farming that kills the soil over expensive tracts of land and results in deforestation, as well as mass animal husbandry and its contribution to global warming. We encourage the church to create channels for the authentic voices of those impacted by climate change to be heard, enhancing and creating the means for the voiceless to speak for themselves. We urge the church to speak out with prophetic voice in ecumenical solidarity to government and corporate entities calling for radical changes in policy and practice to mitigate these global issues that threaten the future of the earth. We call on the government to promote job creation through local production rather than import of solar panels and other materials used for renewable energy. We call on the government and the private sector to invest and support young entrepreneurs developing climate-friendly products and to provide capacity building for the renewable sector. We reject the inclusion of additional coal in the IRP Integrated Resource Plan, which violates human rights and the future of Southern African youth. We support the youth who are spearheading a legal battle against the government over climate change and demanding that new coal be removed from the African energy future. We commit to the protection of marine life, especially endangered species such as the African penguin, and we continue to stand against seismic blasting of the oceans for oil exploitation, among many other examples of human abuse of Earth's natural resources. We call on all of our faith communities and all people of goodwill to recognize our responsibility to care for God's creation. I read this statement as a reflection of the matters and the things that the faith community, at least as I have encountered and lead them, have wanted the nation to take seriously on. So as you continue then your own reflection on this work, please be assured of our own sense of support for the renewal of the moral and ethical leadership to take us through to this next phase of the reduction of the impact of climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reverend Mola. That was excellent and gives us a lot of interesting things to think about. The raising of this sort of moral and ethical basis, I think, is really critical, and it also illustrates that we need more pastors and faith leaders in our Eurasian leadership. So thank you for that. We really appreciate it. You did mention bringing together people from different stakeholder groups, and so that is the next phase. So what we're hoping to do is give you the opportunity to engage as the faith group, and we're doing the same with youth and business and civil society, as I mentioned earlier. Sort of probably, I don't want to fix a date, but later in the year, we will be hosting a colloquium. We will bring everybody together. So we'll have communities, people of faith, business people, civil society people, all come together to discuss where we might have differences, where we agree, and that will be kind of the last step in formulating the recommendations that we then give to the President and to the Minister of Environment. So yeah, thank you very much. We're going to take a quick break, but before we do that, I want to just sort of talk a little bit about how we can start getting your feedback. Language is important, so I know English might not be everybody's first language, and I apologize that it's my only language. But we have people in our team that speak at least some, most of South Africa's 11 official languages. So please feel free to speak in your own language, and we'll do our best to translate. But also you might not want to speak at all. And so what I've done is I've put some post-it notes on each of your tables. And we welcome you to please just dot some ideas on that. And you can either hand them to us or stick them on one of the charts at the back. And I'd like you to please think about 3 questions. What are you worried about in this NDC process? We've had a couple of examples already, but what is kind of at the back of your mind that you think we need to deal with? What principles should we be following? And there's a couple that have come up, and it's been a clear focus of what Reverend Molo said. And then, are there any specific actions or targets that you would like us to be including in the NDC? So I wrote those 3 questions in red on the flipboard at the back. So if you forget them, they're written down. But that's kind of what we'd like you to think about. And while you're having tea and while we're chatting, if you just think of something, write it down. And stick it on there or leave it on the table, get it to us afterwards. So we'd love to hear from you however you would like. Also, as I mentioned, you might have a thought on the way home or in 2 weeks' time or 6 weeks' time that you want to share with us. And I wrote our email address on that flipboard at the back. It's mitigation@climatecommission.org.za. If you want to take a photo of that or copy that down, we're happy to hear from you whenever you have thoughts and ideas. And of course, we'll also give you the opportunity to look at whatever we draft, which we will do later in the year. So with that, we're gonna, yeah, use your mic, please.
Sorry, before we head off to the break, there are some questions online, Steve.
I think we'll take them after the break because I've exhausted everybody with my monologue. But thank you. We will take those questions online. So let's take a 15-minute break. If you didn't mind trying to keep it to 10 so we want to hear more from you. The tea will be outside, sort of kind of across the corridor. And there's still some fruit and snacks here as well. So please help yourself, come back in 10 to 15 minutes. We'll start again and we'll be listening to you, the audience, and those people online. So thank you very much.
take a photo of you, maybe, I mean, I don't know, next.
Okay, we do.
Um,
Oh, I see. Okay. Let me just quickly. We're going to get going in 2 minutes. If people can start making their way back, please. Camera start. Okay, I think we'll start again, and those of you that are still in the coffee queue can stay in the queue and join us when the machine is ready. So the next part of the discussion, as I said, is to hear from you. Please do keep writing the ideas on post-it notes to those 3 questions. And I remind you the questions: what are you worried about? What are the things that you're concerned about? Obviously, we're thinking here in the context of an NDC. You know, it is a climate question, and so we can't resolve every single issue, but please do be thinking about that. What principles should we follow? I think it's very important. And then what specific actions or targets should we be including in the NDC? So those are all important questions. And we'll be talking about those now and dealing with some more questions, but also, you know, as you have ideas, write them down. And I mentioned the email address, mitigation@climatecommission.org.za. But also for those of you who are online and don't have the opportunity to write things on post-it notes, we have created an online board for you. And it's a Miro board, and that link has been dropped into the chat of the online meeting. And so you should be able to click on that, which will take you to a web page that you can put post-it notes on. So you basically just add a post-it note, drag it to where you want it, and put your details in. And we have created those same questions for you online. So please do participate online. We are really keen to hear your thoughts. Okay, so there were some questions online that we were going to deal with when we got back. So, Martha, would you please share those with us?
All righty. So we have one question from Basanda Nurgazi. She says, or he says, currently there's no established framework to devolve the NDCs to provincial and municipal levels. Experts and professionals working on climate action planning at the local government level urgently need guidance in this regard. This in turn guides the types of projects municipalities can undertake and invest in to make meaningful progress towards the 2050 NDC targets. She goes on to say, it is essential to recognize that local government municipalities are custodians of the land. Of the land where all climate, I'm just having problems scrolling down.
Well, let me answer the first part while you deal with this, the second part. So I think that's a great point. I think that's something we need to include in our recommendations. So when I put up that original slide that talked about how the NDC links to local legislation, and we talked about the Climate Act and the sets, just a reminder that the Climate Act also, as the question was saying, is basically asking, how do we establish an adaptation system? And it puts this obligation on municipalities and other government departments to do risk and vulnerability assessments. And it's a big task. And I would go one level further to say that when we start thinking about this question of economic diversification that we left off with at the end of the previous session, is local government through their local economic development plans are also critical in that process. And so the role of local government in climate change, both on the physical risk and adaptation side, but also on the mitigation side, is really important. And so how do we build their capacity? And I guess what the speaker is saying is, like, what mechanisms do we use that for? So certainly it's embedded in the Climate Act, so that's a good start. And SALGA, we're actually meeting with local governments tomorrow. They have programs to help build the capacity of local government. So I wouldn't say that there are no systems. I think there are definitely some systems, but they certainly could be improved and strengthened, and we will include that kind of thinking in our recommendations.
All right. To summarize, the question then is, how can today's discussion contribute to offering a framework solution for downscaling the NDCs to local municipalities and faith-based organizations? So that's one question, Steve. We have another one from Frederique, noting that the agriculture value chain contributes about 1/3 of the emissions. Is there any modeling that can be done, including agroecology as a way of adaptation and mitigation?
Yeah, so to the first part of that question, we will have to think about it. I think it's a good observation. I will also have to think about whether that sits inside the NDC. So we can only do so much with the NDC. What we're pressuring the team to do is all of the feedback we must give to the president must be under 10 pages. He doesn't have time to read a 200-page report, So we have to distill this down into what are the most important things we want to say to the president. But there are other things that must come with this. And so all the feedback that you give us will go into our broader program, and we'll be thinking about how to deal with these issues. But I think the idea of how do we integrate the NDC target and thinking into our overall systems of governance, including local governments, a very good one. I think we must think about that more carefully. On the agricultural side, look, agriculture and food security is a big thing, dependence on water, the contribution of how we do farming to emissions, and therefore how we mitigate, are very important. We do have models that integrate that kind of thinking. I don't have enough time to get into all the detail now, but that is included in our modeling, and it is an important sector. But I would also say that we have to do that kind of thinking for every sector. So no one is immune from this. We all have to change. Mining, agriculture, manufacturing, banking, everybody has to do their bit for us to get to net zero. But obviously there are some sectors that include agriculture that need a little bit of extra focus. Agriculture, manufacturing, mining, energy and power obviously are the sort of the biggest emitters, and transport is also important. So I tried to make a shorter list, but I ended up listing everything. So everything is important, but we note the question about agriculture. Anything else online for now?
I think those are the two critical ones.
Okay, good. All right, so we've got lunch at 1. So what time is it now? 11:30. So we've got an hour and a half for us to discuss these things and for you to raise your points. I keep reminding, please use the post-it notes. We're very happy to take feedback via that. mechanism, but we're also very happy to discuss it in the room. And I'm upfront going to say I'm not going to have answers to everything that you ask, but we will take careful note of them and include them in our discussions. Okay, so we had a question at the back. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm not sure if it's a question though. For staff say, yes,
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to ask if it will be possible to include waste and e-waste management on the report, because that contributes to more emissions, the kind of waste we have, particularly the paper, the plastics and the electronic waste. I do not think we have found a solution yet of how we deal with those. And we are also not manufacturing them, which will take me back to being going back to being an industrialized country, because at the moment, at least in the space where I am, I know we import almost everything. And the other point was when she mentioned, I will mention them because she mentioned them. So if they sue, they will sue her because she was the speaker. She mentioned BP, and I know others, even locally, that their ESG report does not say what they've committed. It's like they've committed for us to hear, but they're doing the opposite. So for some of us, what we are doing is to not boycott necessarily, but to buy from those who are producing products that are environmental friendly. And the ones that are environmental friendly, they will also say in their labels to say this is an environmental friendly. Even if it's petrol, they will say if it's eco-friendly or not. I can't hear. Oh, sorry. The first one was a recommendation on waste and e-waste management. And the second one is that we decide to buy green or environmental friendly products. And I believe that's the way we will get businesses to also cooperate. And then the Reverend Mole, I picked up the issue on behavioral change investment. And I think that is the big issue that needs to be considered, because if people are not empowered, they are not capacitated. If each household knows what to do to be more greener and more environmental conscious, I think we won't need to have so much budget spent on a lot of things, because we will each be playing our role in our legal corners. But at the moment, it's like the expectation is like big businesses and government must do something and the rest of us must fold our hands. So I believe that empowering the community at large, even the village where I come from, that would be great, because I believe everybody wants to play a role. And the Constitution also calls us to be responsible citizens who have rights and responsibilities. I wanted to ask the SACC if they can also, in addition to the statement that Reverend read at the end, which I fully agree with, I would have loved to see the alternatives that they are proposing, to say if we do away with fossil fuel, what's the plan? How are we moving forward? What are the alternatives? Because obviously we cannot just say no more petrol because we don't have electric cars. So I would have loved, to hear what are the alternatives that the SACC is proposing. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, those are all important things for us to note. I have one interesting anecdote to add to that. Certainly this was true a couple of years ago, but there is more gold in a ton of e-waste than there is in a ton of ore. Right, so it's a resource. It's not waste if you think about it like that. And if we start thinking about the circular economy and its impact on climate change, so that's really good. And I think the idea about thinking about where we can prioritize climate and environment issues that also solve other problems like service delivery and health, like waste collection. So those ideas are noted. Thank you. We had a question here and then a question there, or not necessarily a question, could just be a comment.
Thank you, Reverend Hololo from Faith-Based Organization in Gauteng Province. Yeah, I think the subject of climate change, as I joined last year, I found it to be a very, very difficult, especially when it comes to us, the local people. And obviously we had a capacity building, but I think we still need to do more. And my prayer from yourselves is that maybe sometimes we need to have, especially with the faith-based organization, planning together, maybe sometimes instead of planning for us, so that we identify the real stakeholders. Because I'm looking at last year and today, I'm not sure whether we will be able to cover many grounds. So somewhere along the line, may we have that identification of who are stakeholders in the faith-based organization so that we be able to deal with this subject. Like I say, it's a very deep, last year I had to struggle with words. I had to go in Google while we were teaching. Also issue of the land. There's a person that comes from Soweto, from Alexander. If you look at the areas that you are staying in, and one of the things that you spoke about was, not really spoke about, but in terms of implementation, you spoke about the waste and how we also must use locals. People need to do gardenings and everything, but we still have got a problem with the land issue. I'm looking at, let's say, just as an example in Soweto, houses are so close together. When you talk about gardening, always is a very big issue. So somewhere along the line, government needs to release the land that they own to us, maybe churches, maybe individuals, maybe organizations, so that we do gardening. Because I know in clinics, we speak about one clinic, one garden, but it's not enough because many people are also not really trained when it comes to issue of agriculture. So we still have got a lot of work to do. Because as I was sitting here, I was thinking of the faith-based organization that we need to start an environmental group wing in the faith-based, but that also will need a lot of resources. So these are just the thinking of how can the PCC bring us in terms of those and the dialogues that Moruti Molo was talking about. Maybe I'll take it back to him that maybe the faith people, because our unity also is at risk, we're not united, and our voice, our prophetic voice that is speaking about is compromised because of our unity. So to him, maybe we need to identify again the stakeholders, the leaders, and then we all come together. Thank you.
Yeah,
God bless you.
Thank you. The important point for me there is for us to truly achieve procedural justice, we need to be talking to a lot more people than we are. And we're very conscious of that in the PCC. So Zimasa, who was asking the questions online, is part of our stakeholder communications and consensus team, and it's her job to kind of think about that. And we're always conscious of how far short we fall of what we'd like to do. And so I think the only way forward is to partner with people like yourselves. And I said before, there's a temple or a church or a mosque in nearly every community in the country. And so how do we work together to help build your capacity, to help build other people's capacity so that we can reach more people and vice versa? So, we're excited about what we could do with the faith community. It's one of the main reasons we include you in our programs, and there's a faith commissioner as well, I perhaps should have mentioned earlier. So we take that suggestion on board. We have to do a bit of thinking about how we do that, but that's probably something that we should do together. I had a question there, and then come to you guys. So
peace be upon you. Can you hear me?
Get as close as you can to the mic when you talk, please.
Peace be upon you and the mercy and the blessings of the Almighty, all my colleagues and peers in the room. My concern, not my personal, but with the community I come from, which part of it is you? And part of it is not here. A bigger part of it is not here. We have a question that bothers us quite, that we come in when things must be corrected, when we must make commitments on stuff that is already formulated. Where is it conceived and by whom? For instance, in South Africa, we are an economy highly based on the burning of fossil fuel. And what amazes us is that we see this fossil fuel that is supposed to be generating copious amounts of carbon being exported in truckloads through Richards Bay. If it is so harmful, where is it going? That bothers us. And whoever is using it, how are they using it? And history tells us that, in fact, it's an accepted thing. Research too tells us that South Africa is the first continent, and Africa is the oldest continent. Africa being the oldest continent, I don't think it is appropriate that it should be hearing from other continents how to curb stuff like climate change, how to live, in fact. Africa taught the world how to live. But today it is the world teaching back to Africa what Africa taught them initially. How about allowing Africa to have a conversation, a dialogue on climate change that is commensurate with the ways of living in Africa that could lead to Africa saving the entire world? Because even though colonialism corroded and eroded African culture and ways of living, genetic memory still lives. The people alive in Africa are still born of those people who were experts, who taught the world how to navigate, who taught the world how to fly, who taught the world how to build pyramids by hand without mathematical. Calling things by certain names doesn't make you more knowledgeable than the person who built them without using those words. That's your lexicon from your language, but that person might have used a certain lexicon from his language and came up with the structure that they came up. So I'm saying in all this, my community says, give Africa a chance to breathe. Let things not be brought to Africa so that Africa can apologize for polluting when it is hard to believe. We hardly have industries in South Africa. What are we polluting with what? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Two quick comments on that. I mean, the question about where are the climate policy and ideas conceived and by whom? It's a very important question, right? And in a democracy like South Africa, those questions and those solutions need to be determined by the people, right? And so I think there is a critique of the process that we have to think about. Who gets to input? How are their capacity? And lots of people have spoken about building capacity. What channels do they have? And how do we kind of come up with this much more collective South African and African way forward? And just to touch on the point about Africa and Africa's leadership, the opportunity in the climate transition for us as Africans is to shift the power base of how the world works, right? Africa will have amongst one of the biggest populations in the world by 2050, right? We have young people who are still productive and capable, whereas many other countries don't. They call it the demographic dividend, right? We have critical minerals. We still have resources. We haven't destroyed our forests, right? And so we as a continent can use those resources and those skills and our people to shift the power base back to something that's more equal. So there is a global equality justice issue happening here. So I really support the ideas about how do we have these dialogues both within Africa about South Africa about process and also within Africa. So there was a comment here and then here.
Thank you very much. Let me come close.
Just make sure your mic is on. Sorry.
Thank you very much. This is a very informative session, and I'm grateful. First of all, with everything that I've just heard here, I've learned a lot, especially from everybody that is sitting here and those online. Now, my concern is, I'm going to repeat on this, the awareness. Educate us, reach out to us. I mean, for myself, coming from the location, now learning about climate change and everything, you're like, wow, is there anything like that? But now I'm taking this opportunity and taking it back to the location and say, guys, we can reach out to the government. We can tell the government what to do and how do we want this to improve. So that is my main thing that I'm going to do right now. But now, if you look at the scriptures, for those who are from faith-based, it says, my people perish because of lack of knowledge. So it stresses on the fact that we don't know, we need knowledge. So the more you reach out to us, the more you educate us, have more programs on this, more programs, reach out to us, not only flyers, but let us sit down with you in the location, speak to you, ask questions, because we are concerned and we want to know. And again, people they are lazy, or maybe I can say they are ignorant because they don't know. Not that but because they don't know. If they don't have information, how can they change the situation? Now, the second point I wrote here, it's the budget. I'm sorry, I know the budget is not favorable at the moment, but I'm going to speak about the budget. How many percentage are allocated by the government to climate, to economic climate on this program? How many percentage is allocated by the government? Is the government that concerned? Or is it just us people trying to bring it to the government that this is important? How much are they bringing to climate, to economic climate or climate change? That's my most concern. How much is allocated? Because if they put more money on it, it means they are concerned about it. You see, where your money goes, that's where your heart is. I'll give you an example. Say, for example, you spend more money on alcohol. That's where your heart is. And nobody can change that. So if the government is concerned about that, let money go to that. Let them speak by money. That's what I'm concerned about. Secondly, we can talk about climate change and climate whatever, but at the moment, what is most important? Waste. You know, people are not educated, or people they know, but they're just ignorant. But the more outreach we have on this, the more of your guys we have on this, who go out there, reach out to us and educate us. I mean, the better South Africa we're going to have. I mean, I can't change my community alone, but if with you guys, I can do it. Now, secondly, agriculture. We need to emphasize on the importance of agriculture. I mean, with agriculture, we're creating more jobs. And food storage, I mean, the scarcity of food currently in South Africa, more families are going hungry. But now if you concentrate more on agriculture, more on planting, more on educating, more on grooming farmers, more on teaching people that grow your spinach, unlike buying it. That would really increase employment, which is a very big issue currently. Most people are unemployed, and it will also increase on us meaning it will limit us exporting. We want to export more. We'll have more food in South Africa. Unlike you having to export cucumber from Kenya, you having to export carrots from Mozambique. Why can't we grow our own and keep the economy running? Now, lastly, I'm going to mention this point. Okay, I've just said it, that it will decrease on exportation and create more jobs. Thank you, and thank you for the platform.
Thank you. Yeah, and please do, as the speaker was saying, share the email with people that you work with and in your communities. We want to hear from them. So if they're not able to be here today, we're still hopeful to hear from them. There were two questions at this table. You first, sir.
Thank you, Steve. I'm Siva Naidu, representing the South African Hindu Mahasabha, which is the premier representative organization representing the Hindu faith in our country. I want to lend support to the previous speakers, Francesca, the executive director of SAFCEI, and the Reverend Mzwandile Molo. I mean, we are an important sector, the faith-based community. And I think both Francesca and Reverend Mzwandile Molo, the General Secretary of the South African Council of Churches, articulated very, very clearly how important a role the faith-based sector can play in climate justice and the issues really around climate change. Now, you know, it was really music to my ears when the General Secretary spoke to, you know, it's either life or death. And he placed great importance and emphasis on the faith community, which is cross-cutting. He said, we are facing, you know, the crossroads. Do nothing is not an option. We have to stand up. What is it that we can do? We cannot fiddle. We need to invest in mitigation, make sure that our people are not left out. Education, behavior is so, so important. You know, how do we speak ethically as business? So the subsequent speakers also reiterated the whole issue of awareness. This climate change, climate justice, and the issues relating to same appear to me as a concern, you know, of the middle classes, the intelligentsia, the petty bourgeoisie, if you would like, and that greater investment needs to be placed in our communities, and that we need structures on the ground. Now, our people need to become aware. And the slogan that I want to talk to is our country, our concern, which talks to patriotism, okay? And our community, our concern. So wherever we are, I live in the northern suburbs of Johannesburg, typical middle-class, petty bourgeois community, where they place great emphasis on separating waste at source. Now, does this happen in our townships, particularly in the informal townships, where people live cheek by jowl and where the fight for survival, you know, reigns supreme, as opposed to an issue like climate justice, which appear quite distant from the informal settlements and where the majority of our people live. So the impassioned plea that I want to make to the Presidential Climate Commission in pursuing this issue towards a just transition is to start investing in our communities, engaging in a more robust way organs of civil society, particularly the faith-based community will coalesce around Interfaith South Africa, which really is run administratively by the South African Council of Churches. I thank you.
Thank you. Do you have a question, sir?
Thank you, Steve, for the opportunity. I think my point has been covered by Mama, whatever that I wanted to say. Actually, I wanted to emphasize the point of the land. I'm on the property space, and whereby we have a lot of lands here in South Africa, which are not used. So we want at least the land so that we can utilize that lands, because there's a lot of lands that has been possessed by government, but they don't give us those lands. So we want those lands so that we can utilize those lands. We don't have food in South Africa. We don't have almost anything. So we have to utilize those lands. Please just give us the land. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I hear many murmurs of agreement. Okay, let's take an online question or two, and then I'll come back to the table at the front, and then you, sir.
One question online, which is very nice as it speaks to what we can do in our journey towards a net zero future. So Reverend Rachel Mash says, how do we take tree planting on properties of faith communities to a scale to cool our communities? Given that between a home in a leafy suburb with insulation and a shack in an area with no trees, there are about 15 degrees difference in temperature. Rachel goes on to say, churches have land and a congregation that can water those trees every week. And then another one from Rachel, Reverend Rachel Mash, what are the plans for public transport?
Yeah, I mean, what I like about what Reverend Mash is saying is, like, what can we do as a faith community? Like, how do we use the churches? How do we use our grounds? How do we use our reach? I love that.
Agency.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The question about public transport is really interesting. So in decarbonizing transport, right, which is as important as any other sector, there are things that you can do that decarbonize things that have low justice outcomes. If we transition to electric vehicles, we can get to net zero, but you perpetuate the same kind of challenges of people being able to access opportunities and so on. The things that you can do that are more just are some of the things that you've mentioned. Spatial planning. How do we locate communities? Where are the opportunities for those communities? But also then this very important point by Reverend Mash, which is public transport. How do we make public transport more effective, safer, cheaper? And if you solve some of those problems, you also solve air quality problems. To the point that was raised earlier, you can solve multiple problems with some interventions. So yeah, both very important interventions. We have noted them. Thank you, Reverend Mash. Then we had 2 points here and then one here.
Good morning. My name is Molly. I'm from an area called Katlehong. I would like to emphasize more on the awareness thing, the awareness issue, since we are from where we are coming from the townships. In most cases, such events, our people or our community need such events so that they can, you guys and us can be on par with what you are trying to achieve. Because I still think and believe that the masses are down there, and at the same time, the masses have been neglected. So it would be very much ideal for you guys to have maybe a partnership with those guys. Because since I am from the township, we've been planting trees. We have a target of planting about 1 million trees, because we want to help with the situation that we are currently at. And we cannot do this on our own. We need such institutions to come and help, because I think from 2023 until now, we have planted about over 500 trees in different schools. So it could be, some of the trees are shade trees and fruit trees. Fruit trees, we take fruit trees to schools where we say, okay, and then from the school, they also have a ground, a sports ground. From the sports ground, we also use shade trees for the shade. So at least we are trying to help wherever we can with the current situation that we are facing as the country. So this information, and as well as if we, because remember, we are doing the agricultural stuff. And our principals are giving us a hard time because whenever, let's say maybe the shade trees, it is not helpful to us if the principal cuts down a tree, whereas the tree is supposed to protect the community or the environment. So such information, we just need different stakeholders to be on par with what you guys are trying to achieve. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And you actually reminded me of something. I had the privilege of traveling to Spain last year to Barcelona, and all of their parks where they've planted trees are labeled climate refuges because it's 8 degrees cooler than the rest of the city. So when they have a heat wave, people go to these parks and they're kind of safe places. So it's very interesting. Yeah. Ma'am, you had a question?
Thank you. My name is Storia Sitisho, Reverend Storia Sitisho from the SACC Gauteng province. I am very thrilled about the amount of scientific research that has been done and also the commitment to tap into indigenous knowledge. For me, what is really coming through is the acknowledgement of each and every one of us as having something that we can actually do, to actually also affirm the collaborative power that you are having, that we can all do something in our corners, much as the damage that we are seeing coming from the history of this country. It also helps us to realize that nothing can be, about us without us. That we also know that it is important for us as we are in communities to ensure that we educate people about littering, about dumping, and about all things. So for me, those small little things are very, very important. And to also, to make the rich and those who are in the know realize that climate change will affect all of us. It doesn't matter how much you have, it doesn't matter how much you have, put away. When it happens, I mean, you have shown us here that, the GDP will not be what it is right now. Everything will follow, economics will follow. So it is important for all of us to realize that we have collaborative power, but also that you use the power that you are having as community in local communities. In the community that I'm actually in, I'm based in Soweto. We have been doing this for over 20 years. Now we have partnered with the Department of Forestry, and Fisheries. We have partnered with water, Johannesburg Water, and all of those others, that we are having, a significant way that we are seeing. That Pick It Up has come on board, that the UJ has come on board. And we are now in a community doing exactly what I think you are doing. The research is going on. What is the stream? Because there is a stream that goes through Soweto, the Klebas Street. How that is affecting the local communities, how that can actually be changed into something that can work. It is working, and it is ordinary people. It is me and you and those who are called the vulnerable and the poor, who have come to the party to sort of take and mitigate the things that are actually working against the communities on this. So it is, and it started with the dream of one of the guys. I thought he would be here with us, but we are planning for something next week, so he couldn't. So we know that for me, the collaborative power must never be undermined because there's little, information, the little dialogue, those awareness, those invitation to come and clean up the dumping places. It's very important. It conscientizes people. It shows. And I think Francesca spoke about the littering and the recycling of what can be done. Nothing goes to waste. And if we can start seeing litter as something that can actually be turned into economics, so people will be able to do something. But thank you so much for the encouragement. Thank you for the affirmation of all of us here, not only faith communities, but all of us here that are here have got something that we can do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I love that idea. I'm inspired by that. We need to communicate as the PCC about climate change and what needs to be done, but you're already doing so much. So let's communicate to other people what you're doing, because that will encourage people and build their belief. So as a master, maybe that's something we must think about from a comms perspective. What are people doing? Because there's lots going on. And this phrase, nothing about us without us, is one of my favorites. Like, we should be thinking about that. Okay, so we had a question from you or a comment from you, sir.
Good day. My name is Malik Arafat. I'm with SAFSE. I'm also representing the African Diaspora Muslims Assembly, which is an organization, African Muslim organization based in South Africa, but we've got reach across different parts of the continent as well. This is a wonderful opportunity for us as Africans to think about our future. And as we all know, our future, our continent is, marred by the impact of what has happened in the past 500 years. And to a great extent, we find ourselves trying to rectify what was made wrong already by forces that came into the continent. We're aware that a lot of that what we're discussing about is impacted really by very powerful organizations, corporates, etc., that determine how things are done, whether they operate as syndicates or they operate legally. For instance, in the area of mining and water, for instance, we realize how the impact these groups have on our people. So even as we speak here as the faith groupings, we are unable to have control over, who controls the water, for instance. You go to Hammanskraal in many different parts of the country. There's a huge water crisis there. And if you look deeply, you realize that it's actually deliberate. It's all about how people making money out of it. You go to certain communities, the mining communities, you realize how, certain syndicates are controlling or, taking over mines that are not theirs and, impacting negatively on the environment as a result of that. So the challenge that we're facing here is that of leadership. And for me, I think this is the most critical matter, that the leadership that takes charge of these matters is critical in terms of the change that will happen. The faith communities in South Africa represent almost 80% of the community. And there's a slogan that we always hear that says majority rules. And I keep asking the question that if 80% of the population is religious, how come the affairs of the country are run by people who are non-religious, who openly tell us that they are socialists and atheists, etc.? And we allow that to happen. And why is it that the faith communities are not taking action in making sure that they take over the running of the matters of the society? All of us that are seated in this hall at this point in time are faith leaders. And I want to pose this question to you and say, how much are you saying to your constituencies, to your followers, regarding taking charge of their own affairs? Rather than us constantly promising people heaven, yet we live on earth and we're not taking charge of our matters on earth. Let us, as faith leaders, take charge of the affairs of the people on the ground so that, you know, the work of the commission, for instance, can become easier because we represent the people on the ground more than anybody else. And therefore we can be of impact, of a greater impact than any other grouping in the country to make sure that the necessary changes take place. And this is my plea to everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you. That's key.
Mm.
It's important. Thank you. We had a question here, and then was there another one at that table? No. And then we'll go to the back. Oh, there was here. Yeah, thank you. Then we've got two here, and then we'll go to the back again. Ma'am?
Thank you, Steve. I'm Reverend Sheila from SAFC. As SAFC, we are being trained and empowered to go to the community to create awareness and to educate people about the environment and the agroecology. And I think if all of us, as we go or attend these things, we make it our problem, our issue, that whatever we have gathered, we go out and empower those who are unable to have this opportunity like we do. This is an opportunity. If all of us can make it possible to go down to the roots level, the poor of the poorest, and make an impact and change like it is now, as SAFC, we are requested and required to bring report about what we have learned and how we have impacted and touched the community. And I am happy today, as these youth that are speaking today are those that are being touched by SAFC. And now you can see that they are making an impact in the community because we transfer whatever we have received. Now today, as I'm speaking here, I'm appealing to all of us, and more especially the church leaders, as we do have the platform to impart information, to educate. Our people are hungry for knowledge, because as one has said, our people perish because of lack of knowledge. We are where we are today, not because of lack of the resources or not because of lack of finances, but in most cases, we are poor in the mindset. We don't have the knowledge. So let's go out and help our people to care for the environment and to be able to use whatever space they have so that they can get food. There's no food scarcity. We can produce, and our youth can. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, this theme of agency and leadership is coming across so strongly. I'm really appreciating that. Yeah.
Okay. I'm Nathaniel Matlo from Limpopo, with SAFC and SCET. My concern is that I'm worried the way government are handling things. Because when you look at it's either a national, provincial, or local. So people who are in offices such as environmental affairs, waste management, and also in the Department of Forestry, they know, almost of them, they know nothing about climate change. But is there a program to work on it? So it's hard for us to go to them and tell them about climate change. It's hard to kick the driver. So we are trying by all means to educate the community we are doing the campaigns, the workshops, we're doing tree planting. But when you go to them and seek for resources, it's hard for them to give it to you because they know nothing about. So I'm pleading to the government, what is the best way if you fail to teach these people of yours in the office, what is the best way to allow us or bring them into us so that we can have engagement with them and help the community? And because climate change is real, even these days, the way it's raining, every day when it's rain, we all gonna wake up at night and then look at the water, how things are running. But there are people who are staying in the office doing nothing, according to me. One of the things is just that we are the faith leaders. We cannot fight with the government. We cannot ban in the street to get the resources. Maybe we are vulnerable in terms of these things because they can fight and ban whatever they want to ban and then get their whatever they want to do, but we cannot. We are coming to them peacefully. So can you give us the resources? Can you allow us to work on this? Can you not do the opposite things? Because today I'm teaching them these things. Tomorrow someone is coming and teaching them these things. We're in an agricultural farming. So today someone is coming with an insecticide. So while you are teaching an organic way, a pure way, so the government will bring them the free things of insecticides to go on with it. On the other side, we are preaching the other things. So it's not that I mean hard for us to preach that climate change things. It's not hard. We are doing that from our heart. But the problem is that the driver. So the driver, the one who's on the steering, is going to make us to fall together. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's a very obvious trend kind of emerging that we can build into the NDC. So trying to bring it back to the NDC is this idea of we've identified some clear needs in this community, some clear conflicts with what else is happening in the environment. So we can address the kind of governance leadership issues in the NDC. What do we want of a process? But we can also ask for resources, and the resources to build these kinds of and drive these kind of climate programs and capacity building and awareness programs. And we can try to build that into the requests we make for means of implementation for the support. So this is very helpful. Thank you. So you had a contribution and then we'll come to you.
Okay, thanks, April. Good day, everyone. Who's speaking is Musa Waloi from Future Leaders Project in Mahalakwana Municipality in Limpopo Province. My concern here is based on the municipality in Department of Disaster Management. Because when we ask them about their plans regarding the climate change, their plans is only recovery. And today I learned that the recovery is the one that cost us a lot of money. Because I can give example with the private sector, the Anglo-American. It can give them funds to implement the infrastructure within our municipality, but they're only using them for rehabilitating the infrastructure that is already there, because they are not planning ahead to address, to align or to address the service delivery with the climate change issues. For example, most of the bridges are dilapidated within our municipality because of this heavy rainfall that are happening currently. Other thing regarding the awareness campaigns, we should do what we call service integration with the Department of Education. Because this climate change has been declared, I declare it as a national crisis or as a global crisis, that it has become one of our curriculum in our school systems to say our kids must be taught this climate change at early stage. So I thank you.
Thank you. So this theme of municipalities and municipal capacity building is also coming up very strongly. Yeah, thank you. At the back.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to start with the point of misinformation. If you recall what we experienced during the COVID-19, there was a lot of conspiracy theories. And that's what's happening with the climate change. Some people think it's made out for certain things we don't understand. So it is important that PCC has an actual outreach program, which is gonna go beyond this and go to, now I'm from Venda, Chivasa. So the way we do things is you have a coro. Coro means you are going to the chief's crawl. The PCC will go to the chief to say, this is what we are bringing to the community. And the community listens to the chief. Everybody, it doesn't matter how educated you are. If there is a messenger that comes and says you are called, in my mother tongue, they say, Wakovurao. So when they are calling you at the chief's crawl, everybody is going to go there. And we will have people who will interpret this thing in our mother tongue so that everybody understands what is really happening with climate change. Because if we continue without the unity, particularly within the church, because the church leaders have the highest level of influence and as you heard earlier, 80% according to States SA plus are supposed to be religious. So it means that if we have 50% of those leaders who are saying climate change is the same conspiracy as the 5G and the COVID-19 and everything else, you almost have the whole nation lost. Because now if we believe it's a conspiracy, then we are not going to do anything about it, which will be problematic based on what you had said earlier, that we cannot not do something at the moment. And I think the issue of climate change needs to start at an individual level, households. And as we are each doing our little bit, we are going to go far. When I grew up, we were not allowed to cut trees at the village. You will be arrested for that. But now people cut trees anywhere. Our rivers are dry. And people don't understand the importance of having vegetation and the forest. So this is the kind of education we need to go to the village, because if the rivers are dry, it means even if you plant, I heard people talking a lot about agriculture, but how do you farm without water? Because the water is the main source of farming. If it's not raining, there is no water, there is no river that is flowing. So there are things that we know that we just need to be reminded of, but we need to remove the issue of misinformation, because that in a way counter what the PCC is trying to do. There was an issue of IKS that was raised earlier, Indigenous Knowledge System from online. I just want to bring it back that from the village, we have a lot of information. We were managing climate without science in a sense of we didn't have scientists. Mm-hmm. It was our older people telling us how you ensure that when you farm it like this. How do you ensure that there's no soil erosion and stuff like that? They didn't go to school. It was just information that was passed from one generation to the next. And if the NDC is only going to consider science and leave out the indigenous knowledge, I don't think we are going to go very far, because the indigenous knowledge has taken us for many years. The Moruti, this side of my right, was saying earlier to say Africa taught And now we are being taught. So we need to go back to the way we used to do things because it worked and it was organic, if that is even English. So I just want to say that the NDC needs to also include or consider indigenous knowledge. And the only way to get that is PCC going to Venda, Hachivasa, or Umtata, or wherever, because that's where the information is. These elderly people will be able to tell us how we are going to beat this pandemic called climate change, something that we created, and they will tell us how we reverse it, at least to a point where we can still live without having threatening our lives. From a policy perspective, I would like to say that you presented those stats from and the UIA, what happened in COP 2029, but those are not our context. Our policies and the NDC must be context-based. The NDP report, 10-year review report, which you guys should have because they are your neighbors. The National Planning Commission released the 10-year review report end of 2023, I believe, or beginning of 2024. And they were clearly saying that we have not moved to a point where we can brag about it. So it means that the NDC needs to go because there are issues on climate change and environment in the NDP, our own NDP. And then base our NDC on what the National Planning Commission has found, because if we are just going to follow what everybody else is doing, it won't help us because it's not solving our problem. The triple change remains: poverty, unemployment, and inequality. And we don't have money. That's why the budget was postponed, because they need to find ways of bringing a proper budget that won't kill us. So it means when investments are being made, climate change might not necessarily be a priority, not because government doesn't want to prioritize it, but the triple challenge remain according to the NDP. And that was the whole point of having the NDP since 2012. So I'm just advocating that the policy and the regulations that will come for the Climate Change Act and the NDC should be context-based, not what everybody else is doing, but what is happening in our own environment socio-economically. I think I will end there, Chair. I have written a thesis there on the board.
Great, thank
you.
Yeah, I encourage everybody to have one post-it note on the thing before we leave, so we hear from everybody. That would be great. And I think this point about the NDC being self-determined, like that's baked into the rules, right? The NDC must be based on our context and our experience of climate change and our ability and actions. Like that is a principle of the Paris Agreement. So in full support of that. Comment from you at the front.
Thank you. I just want to add on what we said earlier on. I think from the faith-based organization, I don't think there's a lot of gas emission or greenhouse emission, especially from our properties. Mostly, I think gas emission comes from the businesses. Now, I want to leave this place with trying to understand, because if we speak businesses, we speak also employment, and that affect our members. Because I'm looking at the time when we had a lot of load shedding, this kind of renewable energy like solar and all others, they really did not work well. I don't know in terms of from our communities, because they were not affordable. So I'm just trying to check if we have to go that route. how we are affording that, you know, because these are some of the things that we can advise. And then also we spoke about the waste to use for renewable energy, but how far can that reach to that level that we are with what we are using now? I don't know, maybe we need a lot of education as the faith community on that kind of renewal, because I know some people wanted to use waste. They approached government on that, but they never received anything from the government. So probably we also need a lot of education as the community. And then also, I think we're going to also need the database, because I realize there are a lot of NPOs in our communities that are already dealing with the climate change, but they're hidden. You just see them when we come to the Protea Hotel, that we've got a lot of people that have been involved and we never knew about that. So how possible is it that you connect us with those NPOs so that maybe we can work with them in our organization, and then maybe they can give us more education, because I realize there are lots and lots of them that are more educated than ourselves. So please, if possible, as a leader in the province, I will appreciate that, and then I can try and communicate with them for our faith communities. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very interesting idea. Let's think about that. There is a database within the presidency run by the project management unit of the JET IP team that have a database of projects and social movements to try to match them up with donor funding. So maybe there's something to be done there. But that's very interesting. I mean, on this issue of energy and renewable energy, there is a lot of misinformation to the earlier point that happens in that space. And the challenge is, how do you design an energy system where you have wind and solar that isn't on all the time? What do you do with that? And also, it's expensive for households to put on renewable energy and batteries. It can be very expensive. And so we have to design an energy system for the country that gives people access. Not everybody has access yet. That provides affordable energy. The cheaper we can keep the energy. A lot of people have access to energy, but they can't afford it. So in reality, they don't have access, right? And so that's the challenge. And when we do all the academic modeling and research, what it shows is the cheapest energy system to build on the energy system that we have, so we're not throwing anything away, is to build renewable energy plus storage, so batteries and pumped storage, and what they call peaking support. So the challenge comes in at peak hours in the day between 4 and 7 in the evening. Suddenly there's more demand. How do you provide that demand, especially if it's cloudy or the wind is not blowing? And so you have things that you can switch on fast. Normally gas turbines in the models. And so what we've got to try to do is work out what combination of these things do we need to make an efficient, accessible, cheap energy system. And what the studies show is that you keep your coal running, you close it down as it gets too old. So some of our plants are too old. So, we had a whole bunch of trips over the last week, and that caused load shedding again. Some of those plants we can replace with solar energy and storage, but that'll take time. So while you phase out the coal, you phase on these alternatives, and the studies show that those are the cheapest. But you can't really expect ordinary people to provide their own energy from their own solar power and their own batteries. This is something we have to manage at a state level, and the role of Eskom is obviously very important. So that's kind of just a brief overview of what happens on the energy side. The PCC did do a lot of research, and we wrote what we call our electricity recommendations. So like we're doing this for the NDC, we did this for electricity planning, and we published those in April 2023, so nearly 2 years ago now. But nothing's changed very much since then. So if you're interested, there is that document online. But I'm happy to talk about energy all day. So if you want to get me over lunch and talk about electricity and energy, I'd be very happy to do that. Okay, there was a question here or a comment.
Last comment for the day. Okay. Firstly, I'll start with the electricity one, the energy. It's very good because I was involved in the ESCOM maintenance plan that is currently happening. You know, it's very sad when you see people are unemployed. This is real, I must tell you. And with people being unemployed, they would say, we were happy with load shedding if we can afford that electricity. But now we are left with something that we can't afford. It's not easy to put meal on the table.
That's interesting.
So what are we saying to the community? Now, lastly, why I wanted to speak, I wanted to emphasize on this, slowly emphasize on it. Government, with your pending budget that is not sure when it's coming, kindly allow fair amount to climate change. I will repeat myself. Government, with pending budget that you are not sure when it's going to happen or if it's going to happen, kindly allow fair amount to climate change. Climate change will affect more of us. I mean, you can look at this, unemployment and crime rate. You know, with more crime rate, that is now not manageable in South Africa. Unemployment is more. People are unemployed, and with them being angry, crime, it's a norm, it's an everyday thing. If crime increases in South Africa, we are losing investors. And this affects our economy. So how do you cap the two? You first start by empowering people, allow people jobs. That's where you go back to our discussion. You allow people to do agriculture, feed more families. You know, hungry people, they are more violent. So feed more families. Because you can't employ, 90% of South Africa, but at least you can allow everybody to afford decent meal on the table. Now give people land. It's not like you're giving them the whole South Africa, but obviously if someone comes and say, I have this and I can do this, allow them, empower them. So we are actually capping unemployment and crime at the same time. So lastly, I'm going to say this nicely. Where your money is again, where your heart is, there your money will be. But now with our government, where is your heart? If your heart is on the people, your money will be there. So let's check with the government, where is your heart? That's what we must ask the government. If your heart is with the people, then your money would be there as well. Thank you very much. Thank you for today.
Thank you. There's so many quotable quotes from today. There's a comment here.
Thank you. Thank you once again. What I want to bring to our notice as peers, the faith leaders or the faith community, is that we should not fall into the trap of understanding education as what happens at the universities or at schools. Africa always had education. That grade 1 child who's going to start formal school is educated. All that they need is to hone skills commensurate to their advancing education. The problem with colonialism is it looked down upon everything else that is indigenous. It suppressed all other knowledge except knowledge with an outlook that is Western influenced, so that Africans saw themselves as uneducated. If an African brought something brilliant that comes from education, and that is definitely researched, because Africans didn't just thumbsuck and come up with theories. They were practical. Let me tell you something about this empirical research. Do you have any empirical evidence? This is how it is amassed. You collect data. When you're in the process of collecting data, You have already made a statement. That's why I said, how is this conceived? You have already conceived a problem. Then you collect data to formulate that problem into information that can be used. You ask questions from people like you and I, isn't it? Then those people give you knowledge. Then you go and you make findings. And from those findings coming from the people, you make recommendations. That is how research is done. Africans did their research. They were astronomers, they were astrologers. And up to now, they still do it. As I was saying, there is genetic memory. So by education, please don't look at somebody who calls themselves or who is called doctor or professor. Maybe you would be shocked if I told you who I am in terms of Western education. But I don't want you to know that. It's not important. Because while I'm amassing Western education, you are amassing education and knowledge elsewhere, but yours is not recognized while mine is. So please view yourselves in your operational field as educated. Let us go back to ourselves, to our resources, and respect what we have. We still have such people in our communities who know these things. Climate change, people. In Africa, we didn't have stuff like waste because everything went back to the ground, isn't it? But now, because we have cemented our yards, things can't go to the ground. And we've put very beautiful grass outside of our lawns as if we eat grass. In Africa, everything you threw grew and became food. But because they wanted to starve us, they stopped, they gave us small gardens or no gardens at all, so we could buy. They commercialized everything, including knowledge. Western knowledge to become a professor, a doctor, is commercialized knowledge. African education is pure. So don't tell me Africans are uneducated. They are perishing because they are uneducated. No, they have the knowledge, but it's not recognized because alternative knowledge is strangled on purpose in order to keep Africa down. I'm sorry. So please go home, ask your grannies, how was climate kept? How was climate violence kept? They did it. They knew how to do it. They even made it to rain. They went on the mountain to make it to rain. So why is it now that we're failing? Because we've deviated from who we are. We're trying to emulate someone else and act like them. Please, let's do our best to get back our knowledge and act on it. This climate change thing might be like how Africans were told they can't have 100 goats and 100 sheep and 100 cows because they erode the soil. But now who has 1,000 and 6,000 cows and goats and everything? And are they not eroding the soil? Come to think of it. Thank you. So let's rethink this, reimagine this. Let us be brought to the table, all of us. And if we're not brought to the table, let's bring our own chair to the table and let's sit at that discussion table, not at the consultation table. Because consultation and participation means somebody else has already formulated something. They just wanted to participate to rubber stamp. Let's not do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Question at the back or comment at the back.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rev Mark Ndlovu from the PCI organization, Power Cardinal International. There's something I want to just raise based on climate change. Every time we look at an industrial revolution, we never pay careful attention to the climate change impact of that revolution. And our interests never align with the fact that is that industrial revolution going to alleviate the standard and the quality of the people's lives and the environment, or it's just another investment being done by the powers that be, for lack of a better word, without formally auditing the changes of the climate itself, number one. Number two, the job losses that come with every industrial revolution, because a revolution is always favoring more robotics and less of human hands and participation of anything that has to do with what is of value in the economy, especially in the lives of the people. So I would like us in the faith sector not limiting it in the Christendom, but every faith sector has got a voice in this, in raising the awareness that industrial revolutions have never been in the favor of the people, but actually in the so-called investors, because there's a huge chunk of carbon emissions that just increase and shoot up in a very significant manner in a very short space of time. And we lose the accountability of where the future of the people lies as the religious leaders that represent the people. So I would say for the next industrial revolution, if all faith sectors could put up a thesis that stresses the negative impact on what it has on, number one, the environment, number two, the people. In Christianity, we usually say that the first man came from the ground. So if we are destroying the ground that man came out of, what will be left of man? So everything that the government has to do with in terms of the industrial revolution, they need to now be accountable to the impact it has on the environment. Now, if we're going to be talking about budgets and so many other things that impact the socio-economic scale, and we neglect the fact that an industrial revolution has the people's interests less at heart versus what they propagate, I think as the faith people, that gives us a responsibility that exceeds any other advantage of an industrial revolution when we ignore the disadvantages. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, a very important parallel point there. Climate is not the only thing driving change. And so the fourth industrial revolution and AI and all of these things are happening at the same time. So we can't think about that in just separation from climate. But the point that we don't think enough about the negative impacts and that we must raise them is really key. And I actually read a line in a report the other day that I thought was really interesting. What if we optimize our economy on human interaction and not consumerism? Right, so we're not solving for buying stuff all the time. We're solving for adding value to people and how they interact with each other. I just thought that was interesting, and you made me think of that. Yeah.
Thank you. I won't say this is my last point in case it's not. I just want to talk to us now as faith leaders or people in the faith. We are consumers of what everybody brings. There is no manufacturing or a plant that is owned by the church. There are very limited, if any, schools that are owned by the church. As I was speaking earlier about the issue of misinformation, we carry that and run with misinformation because we don't have our R&D centers. With 80% of the population within the faith communities, it is puzzling to me that we do not have our own research and development center, and we are not innovating on anything. I think the challenge that I want to put back to us is instead of complaining, pointing fingers, and everything else, can we stand up as contributors and move away from the consumer status and start bringing in solutions that will work for the communities that we are serving and the communities that we are representing? Because if we were to go to COP30 next year, they are looking for researched papers, not our thoughts and how we feel and how we don't feel. So I think even the issue of unemployment, I think we need to look at ourselves at the church and not be very proud. Because if we were doing what we are supposed to be doing, we should also be creating employment. Everything we have said here in terms of waste management and everything else, I think if as the church, we have one voice and stand together, we have enough resources to contribute to the challenge of climate change. So I think for me, my call to us is instead of standing at the fence, can we come inside and bring our best? They are the best brains in the church. If 80% of South Africa is in the church or in the faith community, that 80%, it is the one that is occupying all big offices out there. And as for myself, I volunteer after coming out of those professional whatever, I volunteer. So if we each are making ourselves available, I believe we are going to go far from a contribution perspective. What is it that we are bringing to partner with the PCC? That is just the challenge that I'm bringing out there so that we are not consumers. The other issue, Chair, that I think it also needs to be taken importantly, which is coming out over and over again, is that the NDC needs to have some sort of highlight in terms of moral and ethical leadership, because that's what we need. Our plans will not go very far if we don't have moral and ethical leadership. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. Taking frantic notes here. Okay. Last opportunity to comment. I think we don't have any comments online. Anything else in the room, and then I'll attempt to wrap up. Okay, excellent. You one comment here? Good. Please go ahead.
Good day, everyone. My name is Nozwelo Khatebe. I'm from Climate Years. I'm from SACC Climate Commission. Mine is not really contribution, but maybe a request to the faith members that are in this room to say, I'm so disappointed to see a very few young people in this house. So the education and principles and everything that we are talking about in this house, if young people are not getting that, if the information is not getting to them, then it's good as we're doing nothing, because we want this information, we want everything that we're talking about in this house to reach to young people who still have energy, who still maybe have time to implement all those things that we're talking about. So from our churches, local churches, let's encourage young people to be interested in these climate issues. Let's encourage them to make an impact in the community. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think the youth are super important. As I mentioned, we're engaging with the youth on Saturday. So if you're a young person, we do it on Saturday because people from school obviously can't come during the week. So yeah, you're welcome to join us for that. And I know one young person who was looking at the mess that the older generations have created and asked me, do you think that people over 60 should be allowed to vote? Which I thought was really interesting, because, we're making a mess, Okay, so that was very helpful. Thank you. Right, so to wrap up, you're not allowed to have lunch unless you've put a post-it note on the thing. And also, please think a little bit about the question that we got the fewest responses for was thinking about what kinds of targets should we be thinking about. I mean, I know it's the hardest question, but if you can give a little bit of extra thought to that. So I want to start by thanking you all for coming and spending time with us today. We're really grateful. It's stakeholder engagement sessions are not effective unless the stakeholders are here. So we're super appreciative that you took the time out today to share your thoughts with us. A reminder that the process is not over. You're welcome to email us. We will have the colloquium. There will be other opportunities to engage. And there were a huge number of things that were raised. I'm not going to be able to capture them all, but just to let you know the kind of process that we run as we transcribe everything that was said, and we analyze that across all of the stakeholder groups. And one of the things that we submit alongside our recommendations to the president is a stakeholder report. So that even if your suggestion or your concern doesn't make it into the NDC, we're still going to record that and we're still going to share that with other stakeholders and with the president. So a couple of themes that emerged, and I just got a long list, and I'll kind of read them that I heard. There might not be all of them. There was a lot of talk about the procedural justice of the process. How do we include people? Who's coming up with these ideas? How is that process governed? That was a theme. Integration of decisions around climate change into the budget and into other government policy processes came up a lot. Capacity building, education, and awareness was, I think, the single biggest thing that was raised. And there were some related issues around how do we integrate that into traditional governance? How do we integrate that into education? And in particular, how do we think about Indigenous knowledge and our individual and collective power in that process? Waste and multi-impact solutions came up. Building awareness specifically in communities, municipalities came up. How do we counter misinformation? I think one of my bugbears. I think very appropriate to this group. Faith, and your role in moral and ethical and justice leadership, I think, was a very important theme. Faith in reaching communities, playing, what your agency is, and in particular in emergency response came up in a previous session. Agriculture came up both in mitigation and adaptation. Moving action local, I think, was interesting. How do we do things in communities? Economic diversification, localization, local consumption, empowering people with jobs and land. That was a sort of broad theme that I think was important. Land itself and how we make land available and how it's used, how we think about parks, how we think about local agriculture, tree planting came up. Municipal frameworks for NDC, how do we filter the NDC commitments down into other municipal structures? Agriculture came up a lot. What I particularly enjoyed was your thinking about your agency. What can you do? And so that was very exciting. The opportunity for Africa to reset our future, I thought, was also fascinating, and thinking a little bit about international justice. It was an interesting discussion. Governance, corruption, and the behavior of vested interest syndicates, big players came up, and the antidote to that, which I also loved in the theme of agency, was leadership. Like how do we think about leadership? How does faith play a role in leadership? And a couple of people spoke about the role of faith communities in this leadership context, which I guess also links back to this idea of moral, ethical justice leadership. A big point around context being important. We need to acknowledge our local context, our policy context. The National Development Plan came up, and that this is self-determined. This is our plan, which links back to this idea of the procedural justice. We can't do that unless we're engaging with people and understanding what their needs are and what their goals are. And of course, youth is a super important part of that broader community that we need to engage in. So a lot of very useful discussion, and we really are grateful for the time we spent with you today. And as I say, please keep communicating with us. You will have ideas when you're thinking about this later on, and you can please email them to us. So one last point here.
If you can kindly share the summary with us via email.
Sure.
So it'll be easier for us to report correctly to the respective organizations that we represent here.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. I would appreciate that. So we will generate a summary report from this event in particular and share that with you. But we'll add in some of these things. I'm cautious of sharing my list because I probably missed something. But when we have the chance to analyze everything, we will send you a report. And I love the idea of feeding it back to your constituencies. And they may say things to you. So we're very happy for you to be agents of the PCC. If you go out and you talk to your communities and you share with them what we did today, and they have ideas that you didn't raise today, please share that with us. That's part of the inclusivity process. So thank you for saying that. Yeah. Okay, long morning. Thank you so much for sitting through it all. And please stay for lunch. And if you want to harass me about energy questions, I'll be keen to do that. If there are any last points, please feel free. Yeah. Would you like to close in prayer for us? That would be great, if you wouldn't mind. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. You can either pray from that mic or come here. Yeah. Thank you. Wait.
Okay, we can pray. They're asking me to ask people to stand, those that are comfortable to stand. Okay, let us pray. Father, we thank you again as you have brought us into this place. Thank you. Let us, Lord, to take your love out to the people. We thank you, Father, that as we are here, give us that supernatural wisdom, my Father, to understand the importance of why we are here. And may this wisdom, we take it out to our local people. Father, we pray for your divine intervention in this climate change. Whatever, Father, that climate change is affecting us economically, spiritually, socially, intervene, oh God, because according to the scriptures, the earth belongs to you and everything that is in it. You can turn around the situation, oh God, because everything belongs to you. In the beginning, you are the one that made this earth, and you can change. Thank you, Father, as you are going to be living this place, go before us. Show us where the treasures are hidden so that we do not struggle with resources. Give us that wisdom also to be creative in everything that we are doing. In the mighty name of Lord Jesus Christ, our families, we commit them in your hands during this period. Unemployment must not affect us. Financial problems must not affect us. In the mighty name of Lord Jesus Christ, we shall succeed, oh God, in everything that we do, even our nation, oh God, in the midst of all the complaints and the pains and the sanctions, oh God. You are the one that can teach us how to depend on what you have given us, because in the beginning, oh God, you said we should use what you have given us in this earth in the mighty name of Lord Jesus Christ. Thank you, Father, and the food that you are going to eat, we sanctify it with the blood of Jesus in Jesus' name. And bless this commission, bless the leaders, give them more wisdom as they are leading, as they're going to be speaking to other people in Jesus' name. May God bless you all. Amen and amen.
Thank you for the prayer, and thank you, everybody. Please feel free to put more post-it notes on, and please join us for lunch in the restaurants to the right down the stairs. Thank you again. Sorry, I forgot one thing. Yeah, so please also remember you need your name tag to get lunch, but please don't go home with your name tag. Please just put it on the table before you go home, and we will recycle it. Waste was an important theme of today's discussion. Thank you.